Let me share a series of stories with you. I'll go one by one because if they overwhelmed me back then, I can only imagine how they might affect you. I'm Officer Bradley. I retired from the force 10 years ago at the age of 50, after 2 decades of service. Over those years I encountered many things, some mundane, some disturbing, and a few that still haunt me to this day. The story I'm about to tell you is one of the latter, a memory that clings to my mind like a deep thorn in flesh. It happened on January 17, 2005. The call came in just after 11 p.m., a frantic woman claiming she'd locked herself in her bathroom because her boyfriend was trying to kill her. My partner, Mason, and I were on patrol nearby, so we took the call. The house was at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac, the kind of place where silence feels heavier than it should. As we pulled up, I noticed how the yellow light from the flickering lampposts cast eerie shadows on the street. The wind was fierce that night, whipping the bare branches of trees and sending the occasional dead leaf skittering across the pavement. Thick clouds swallowed the moon, leaving the neighborhood shrouded in darkness. Mason and I approached the house cautiously, flashlights cutting through the gloom. The place was eerily quiet, except for the faint tinkling of wind chimes. I knocked firmly on the door. "Police! Open up!" No response. We exchanged a glance, unease creeping into my chest. Mason wasted no time and kicked the door open with a forceful crack. The door swung inward, revealing the dimly lit interior. The air was cold, almost unnatural, and the stillness of the house seemed oppressive. We cleared the downstairs first, methodically checking each room. Empty. No sign of struggle, no sign of anyone. "You hear that?" I asked, pausing in the hallway. Mason tilted his head, listening. Then we both heard it. A soft, muffled sound. Crying. A woman's voice, faint and strained, coming from upstairs. "She said she was in the bathroom downstairs," Mason muttered, a frown creasing his face. We ascended the stairs slowly, each creak of the steps echoing louder than it should. The crying grew more distinct as we approached the second floor. It was coming from behind a closed bedroom door. "Ma'am?" I called out, trying to sound calm and reassuring. "It's okay. You're safe now. No one's going to hurt you." The crying stopped abruptly, as if someone had pressed pause on a recording. The silence was so sudden, it made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. Then, just as quickly, the sobbing resumed. "But he's still here," came the trembling voice from inside the room. Mason and I exchanged a look, our unease now replaced by something closer to dread. "My partner and I checked the entire house, ma'am," I said, stepping closer to the door. "No one's here. You're safe."
Before I could finish, a loud bang echoed through the house. We both turned sharply. The front door, the same one Mason had kicked in just moments ago, had slammed shut with a force that shook the walls. Mason's face paled as he moved to the top of the stairs, gripping the handrail tightly. He peered down toward the front door, his breath visible in the frigid air. "Stay here," he whispered, though the tremor in his voice betrayed his nerves. I stayed by the bedroom door, my hand on my holstered weapon, listening intently. The woman inside the room had gone silent again. The house, too, seemed unnaturally still, save for the faint creaks of the floorboards as Mason moved. "Mason?" I called out after a moment, unable to see him from my position. No response. Only the sound of the wind outside, rattling the windows. That's when I heard the faintest whisper, so soft it could have been my imagination. "He's here." But the voice didn't come from the bedroom, it came from behind me. "Just the wind, I think," Mason said, his voice quieter than usual, as though trying to convince himself more than me. Then it happened. A voice, soft yet unmistakably clear, came from the bathroom behind the door. "Are you sure, Officer Bradley?" the woman asked, her tone calm and unsettlingly familiar. My heart nearly stopped. Neither Mason nor I had used our names since arriving at the scene. We'd spoken only in brief commands, our voices sharp and professional. Yet, there it was, my name, uttered by someone we hadn't even seen. "Ma'am?" Mason said, his patience thinning, though I could hear the tension creeping into his tone. "Do you need help or not? We need to make sure you're okay, so step back from the door. I'm kicking it in." A part of me suspected Mason's frustration wasn't entirely about protocol. I think he wanted answers, needed to see who this woman was and how she knew what she did. Maybe more than her safety, he wanted peace of mind. "Hold on," I said quickly, placing a hand on his shoulder. She could be sitting right by the door. We don't want to hurt her." But before Mason could respond, her voice came again, this time deeper, carrying a chilling weight that sank into my bones. "Officer Bradley," she said, her words deliberate and sharp, "tell Mason that if he touches this door, I will visit his family in the late hours of a certain night and break down a door of my own." The color drained from Mason's face. It was the first time I'd ever seen him like that, pale, trembling slightly, as though he'd just stared into the abyss itself. I'd always thought the phrase, "white as a ghost," was an exaggeration. But in that moment, I saw its truth etched into Mason's expression. Before I could stop him, Mason reeled back and kicked the door in with all the force he could muster. The door swung open violently, slamming against the wall with a deafening crash. But the room beyond it was empty.
We stood there, flashlights illuminating every corner. There was no window above the shower, no second door, no way out. Just silence. Yet we both knew, absolutely knew, we had spoken with someone on the other side of that door. We didn't speak as we methodically checked the house again, from the attic to the backyard, scouring every inch for any trace of someone, anyone, who might explain what had just happened. But the house offered no answers. When it was finally time to leave, Mason and I exchanged a look, an unspoken agreement that we'd seen and heard enough for one night. Without a word, we stepped out into the cold, our breaths visible in the icy air. Mason walked straight to the cruiser, his hands visibly shaking as he opened the passenger door. He probably thought I didn't notice, but I did. Mason never drank coffee or anything that might make his hands jittery, which made it all the more unsettling. I slid into the driver's seat and started the engine, reversing the car out of the driveway. Mason stared straight ahead, refusing to look back at the house. But I did. And I wished to God that I hadn't. As I glanced over my shoulder, my eyes caught movement by the side of the house. Near the garbage cans, partially obscured by shadows, was a dark figure. It was crouched low, almost kneeling, as if it were watching us leave. I squinted, trying to make out details, but the figure was shrouded in darkness. Then, as we drove further down the street, I saw it move. Slowly, deliberately, it stood. And it didn't stop. The figure rose higher and higher and higher until its head, its impossible, elongated head, peeked over the roof of the two-story house. Even now, all these years later, I can't explain what I saw that night. I can only tell you this: I don't look back anymore. I'm not a superstitious person. Ghosts, demons, and all that otherworldly nonsense never fazed me. Until that night. Sure, there are events that defy explanation, but they're rare. It takes more than a couple of flying spoons or a door opening on its own to scare me off the job. But what I experienced that night wasn't just rare. It was something I'll never forget. The department didn't find any reason to mark this report confidential, so I'm free to share every chilling detail of what I can remember. This is the story of the most terrifying night of my life. It started as a routine noise complaint, dispatched to us just after midnight. The neighborhood was a quiet one, nestled in a small town that I won't name out of respect for the residents. My partner Paul and I drove down a narrow street lined with neat little homes. At that hour, the place was eerily still. No lights, no movement, just the soft hum of our patrol car's engine. When we arrived, we parked directly in front of the reported house. It stood out among the others, not because it looked unusual, but because it felt wrong. A sense of unease hit me as soon as I stepped out of the car. Maybe it was the way the porch light flickered faintly, or the silence that seemed heavier than it should have been. Paul and I approached the door, the sound of our boots on the wooden porch breaking the stillness. I knocked firmly and called out, "Police, is anyone home?" The door creaked open slightly, and a small face peeked through the gap. It was a little girl, no older than 10, with wide, innocent eyes. Her pale face and frail figure struck me instantly. I crouched slightly, trying to appear less intimidating. "Hey there," I said softly. "Is your parent or guardian home?" She shook her head silently. For a moment, I thought this was going to be a straightforward case. A kid left alone, maybe watching TV too loud and bothering the neighbors. But before I could tell her to keep the noise down and lock the doors, a loud crash came from deeper inside the house. The sound of metal clattering echoed through the darkened hallway. Instinctively, my hand went to my holster. The noise came from what I assumed was the kitchen, but I couldn't see anything through the thick shadows. My brain immediately jumped to the worst conclusion. Someone else was inside, and they weren't supposed to be there. I turned back to the girl, speaking quickly but gently. "Sweetheart, I need you to step outside for me, okay?" She hesitated but obeyed, stepping onto the porch. I glanced at Paul. "Paul, why don't you give her one of those lollipops you always have? You know, the ones you suck on when you're nervous." Paul shot me a look that could freeze water, but the girl giggled softly, the tension breaking for a split second. He led her to the car, trying to distract her, while I turned my attention back to the house. I pushed the door open wider, the old hinges creaking in protest. The air inside was heavy, carrying a faint metallic tang that made my stomach twist. "Police!" I called out, stepping cautiously into the entryway. "If someone's in here, make yourself known." Without a warrant, I didn't have the authority to search the house. I needed a clear sign of a threat to proceed. My heart pounded as I strained my ears, waiting for any sound, any movement. But all I got was silence. Thick, suffocating silence. The house was nearly pitch black, save for the faint light spilling in from the porch. Shadows stretched unnaturally long across the walls, and the air felt colder with every step I took. I stood frozen in the doorway, my senses on high alert, waiting for something, anything, to justify going further. And then, from the darkness, came the faintest creak of a floorboard. I left the door ajar, the dim light from the porch casting long, uneasy shadows into the entryway, and walked back toward Paul and the little girl. "Hey again," I said, crouching slightly to meet her gaze. "I don't think we introduced ourselves. I'm Officer Mike, and this is my partner Paul. What's your name?" She hesitated for a moment, her small hands clutching the hem of her shirt. "Maribel," she said softly. "That's a lovely name," I replied, offering a reassuring smile. "So, Maribel, if you don't mind me asking, where is your family?" As soon as the question left my mouth, the sound of a TV blaring at full volume shattered the silence. Paul and I spun around in unison, our attention drawn to the living room. From where we stood, we could see the television flashing static, its harsh light strobing against the dark walls. "Stay right here," I told her firmly, leading her to the patrol car. Protocol dictated civilians couldn't sit in the front seat, so we placed her in the back for safety. Once she was secure, Paul and I exchanged a look. Neither of us wanted to admit it, but we were shaken. Still, we couldn't leave without figuring out what was happening inside that house. Against every instinct screaming at us to turn back, we stepped inside. The first thing we noticed was that none of the lights worked. Every switch we flipped resulted in nothing but a hollow click. The darkness seemed to press down on us, heavier and more oppressive than before. As we moved cautiously through the house, I kept noticing something strange in the mirrors. Every time I caught a glimpse of a reflection, I'd see what looked like a person standing just behind me. At first, I assumed it was Paul, but whenever I turned around, he wasn't there. "Paul?" I called out softly, but my voice felt swallowed by the oppressive silence. "I'm here," he replied, his voice coming from the opposite side of the house. The realization that I was alone in that part of the house sent a chill down my spine. I quickly made my way back toward the front door, where I finally found Paul waiting. Before either of us could say a word, the sound of running footsteps thundered down the hallway behind us. "Did you hear that?" Paul asked, already reaching for his firearm. "Yeah," I muttered, drawing my own. "Stay close." The footsteps grew louder, heavier, and more frantic, echoing through the narrow hallway like a stampede. We trained our weapons on the source of the sound, ready for whoever or whatever was coming. But no one appeared. Instead, the chaos began. Lamps toppled over, chairs were hurled across the room, and the sound of shattering glass filled the air. It was as if some invisible force was tearing the place apart. "Go! Now!" Paul shouted, and we bolted out of the house, stumbling onto the front yard. The footsteps followed us to the threshold but stopped abruptly as we hit the grass. Then the siren on our patrol car blared to life, piercing the stillness of the night. "Stay here," I said to Paul, rushing to the car. I silenced the siren and turned to check on Maribel. She sat quietly in the back seat, her expression calm despite the chaos. "You okay?" I asked. She nodded, her face unreadable. I walked back to Paul, who stood frozen, staring at the house, His usual calm demeanor was nowhere to be found. Without a word, he pulled a lollipop from his pocket, unwrapped it, and stuck it in his mouth, a nervous habit I'd seen a dozen times before. "You good?" I asked him. "Yeah," he muttered around the candy. I followed his gaze back to the house. "I don't know what to make of this," he finally said. "Me neither." "No, seriously," Paul said, his voice low. "Forget the running invisible man who trashed the house for a second. Did you notice the family photos?" He pointed to Maribel in the car. "She's not in any of them." I frowned. "What are you saying?" "The footsteps stopped outside," he continued. "And then the siren went off. There's a million buttons in that car, Mike. What are the odds?" I shook my head, unwilling to say it out loud. "Paul, are you trying to tell me that Maribel is haunted?" Paul didn't answer. He didn't need to. The look in his eyes said it all. "How do you explain what we just saw?" Paul asked, his voice sharp and unsteady. "I'm sure there's an explanation," I replied, though I didn't believe it myself. Paul scoffed. "An explanation? The TV turns on the moment we take Maribel outside, pulling us back into that house. Someone, or something, was in the mirrors, Mike. It wasn't hiding, it was watching us." I wanted to tell him to shut up, not because he was wrong, but because he might have been right. "You saw it too," Paul continued, stepping closer. "It prowled around, stayed out of sight, then ran outside to the car. You think it was random that the siren went off? I'm telling you, something's trying to get to that girl." I stood frozen, the weight of his words pressing down on me. He was piecing it together faster than I could even process. Before I could respond, Paul turned and began marching back toward the house. "Kuh!" I called after him, my voice rising. "What are you doing?" "It only shows up in the mirrors," he replied, not even looking back. "That's how we'll find it." Against every rational instinct, I followed him inside. The house felt colder, darker, like the air had been sucked out. Paul moved with a strange determination, scanning the room until he found a thick book lying on the kitchen counter. Without hesitation, he swung it against the nearest mirror, shattering it into jagged shards. "What the hell is wrong with you?" I snapped. "That's someone's property." Paul ignored me, crouching down to pick up a shard of glass. He handed it to me, his eyes gleaming with an unsettling mix of fear and excitement. "It's not every day you get to arrest a ghost." I wanted to argue, but his resolve unnerved me. He was taking this too far. But then again, so was I, just by staying. We stood there, side by side, flashlights in one hand and shards of mirror in the other, sweeping the beam of light across the room. Each reflective surface seemed to taunt us, daring us to see something we couldn't explain. And then we did. A skeletal, shadowy figure emerged in the jagged glass, its limbs impossibly thin and elongated. Its fiery red eyes locked onto mine, and before I could react, it lunged. I felt a searing pain across my back as its bony claw tore through my uniform, sending me sprawling forward. The shard of glass slipped from my hand and shattered on the floor, scattering into smaller pieces. I tried to crawl away, but the thing didn't relent. Its claws tore at my shirt and flesh, each swipe igniting a fresh wave of agony. Just when I thought it would rip me apart, gunfire echoed through the room. Paul stood firm, his weapon drawn, firing round after round at the creature. It let out an ear-splitting screech that faded as it retreated into the shadows. Paul rushed to my side and pulled me to my feet. "You all right?" he asked, his voice tight with panic. I nodded weakly, the pain dulling as adrenaline took over. We stumbled back outside, gasping for air, only to find the patrol car empty. Maribel was gone. "What the?" Paul started, but he didn't need to finish. We both knew what it meant. Explaining the events of that night to the department was next to impossible. Every word felt like digging ourselves deeper into a hole of disbelief. The patrol car's cameras, which we had hoped would back up our story, were conveniently disabled the moment we entered the house. Our captain listened in stony silence, his expression unreadable. When we finished, he leaned back in his chair and opened a file on his desk. Sliding a photo across to us, he asked, "Is this the girl you saw?" It was Maribel. "She's been missing for months," the captain said grimly. A heavy silence fell over the room. Paul and I exchanged a glance, but said nothing. I quit the force a few days later. I told myself it was to preserve whatever shred of dignity I had left, but deep down, I knew it was because I couldn't face another night like that. To anyone reading this, I offer one piece of advice. The next time a door opens on its own, or objects move without reason in your home, don't investigate. The sun had vanished over a month ago, leaving Barrow, Alaska, shrouded in an unrelenting darkness. The kind of darkness that gnawed at your sanity, broken only by the weak glow of streetlights and the occasional growl of a snowmobile cutting through the frozen silence. Life went on, as it always did during the long, sunless months, but this year was different. Last December, the darkness brought something else. Something far worse. I've been the chief of police in this town for 15 years. Barrow's a quiet place, mostly. I've dealt with bar fights, domestic disputes, and the occasional tourist wandering too far into the tundra. Routine stuff. My officers, Carl and Dana, and I knew how to handle it. We knew the people, the land, and the rhythm of the night. But nothing in my years of experience could have prepared me for what happened last winter. It all started with a call from Hannah Damon. Her house sits at the edge of town, near the frozen coastline, where the fields of snow stretch endlessly into the dark. I remember her voice trembling over the phone, thin and brittle, like she was holding back tears. "Chief, I'm sorry to bother you, but something's wrong. Charlie hasn't come home." Charlie, her husband, worked maintenance at the oil facility north of town. It wasn't unusual for him to stay overnight during a storm, but that day had been eerily calm. No wind, no snow. He should have been home hours ago. Carl and I headed out to the Damon house. The snow crunched under the tires as we pulled up, the only sound near was quiet. Hannah was waiting outside, wrapped in a heavy parka, her breath fogging the icy air. Her eyes, wide and rimmed with worry, locked onto me as I stepped out of the car. "Chief, something's wrong," she said, her voice cracking. "He always checks in. Always." We reassured her the best we could, but a knot had already formed in my stomach. Something about this didn't sit right. We drove up to the oil facility and found Charlie's truck. Its door was ajar, the cab filled with fresh snow. Inside, there were no signs of a struggle, no keys, no footprints leading away. Just blood. It stained the ice in deep streaks, frozen in bizarre patterns. Carl knelt down, gloved fingers brushing the crimson snow. His voice, low and uneasy, broke the silence. "What the hell happened here?" The blood wasn't just a random spatter, it was a trail leading out toward the frozen coastline. Flashlights in hand, we followed it. Each step felt heavier than the last, the beam of light trembling as it cut through the suffocating dark. The trail stopped abruptly at the water's edge. No body, no signs of life, just more blood. Pools of it soaking the ice. Claw marks gouged deep into the frozen surface, jagged and unnatural. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at the icy wounds. What kind of animal could even make these marks? Carl muttered, his voice barely audible. But it wasn't just the marks or the blood, it was the silence. No wind, no wildlife, nothing. As if the entire world was holding its breath, waiting for something terrible to happen. Hannah begged us to keep searching, but there was nothing more to find. Charlie was just gone. In the days that followed, more people disappeared. A hunter, a woman walking her dog, another oil worker from farther north. Each time the scene was the same. Blood, signs of a violent struggle, but no bodies. The heavy snow and wind erased any tracks, any clues about who or what was behind these disappearances. We were no strangers to bears out here. Big ones, dangerous ones. But this was different. The carnage felt too deliberate, too methodical. It looked almost intelligent. The way the destruction had been carried out, it was unlike anything we had ever seen before. But I kept that thought to myself, not wanting to stir up even more fear among the people. Carl, Dana, and I split up to cover the town, checking in on anyone we could find. We put out warnings, advising people not to stray too far from their homes.
People here were always on edge during the long, dark winter, but now they were downright paranoid, like something was lurking just out of sight. I'll never forget the day I found Sam Walsh. Sam ran Barrow's only general store. It wasn't just a place to buy supplies, it was a social hub where everyone gathered. He was an old-timer, someone who'd seen more winters here than anyone else. I always liked Sam, even though he could talk your ear off if you came in just to grab a pack of smokes. It was Dana who first noticed the store hadn't opened for 2 days. Sam was always the first to rise when the darkness took over. But now, the windows were dark, the lights were off. Carl and I drove down, thinking Sam might have slipped on the ice or fallen ill. We trudged through the snow, boots crunching under the weight of the winter as we approached his house. The front door was already wide open. It had been broken in. The old hinges had been ripped clean off, and the frame had splintered under some kind of force. We stepped inside, our flashlights cutting through the thick, stale air, sweeping over the cluttered shelves.
"Sam," I called, but there was no answer. "Sam, you in here?" That's when we found him. Sam was in the back room, slumped against the wall, or what was left of him. His chest had been torn open, ribs exposed through the mangled flesh and blood that was now frozen into the air. His eyes were wide open, staring at the ceiling in a frozen look of pure terror. The walls around him were splattered with blood, streaking all the way up to the ceiling. It was everywhere. There were tracks, but between the blood and the frost creeping in from the open door, I couldn't make them out. I couldn't make sense of it. Carl gagged, stepping back, trying to cover his mouth. "Jesus, what the hell?" I couldn't say anything. My hands were shaking. This wasn't just an animal killing for food. This was calculated. This was vicious. Whoever or whatever did this wasn't just hunting, it was killing for sport. It was violent in a way that didn't make any sense. That night, I called for a town meeting at the police station. The fear was palpable, thick in the air, just like the darkness outside. People whispered about Sam, about Charlie, about the others who had vanished. I could feel it. Everyone was scared, and nobody knew what to believe. Dana stood by my side, her face drained of color. Carl was near the door, rifle slung over his shoulder, eyes scanning the room as if waiting for something to break in at any moment. "We don't know what's going on yet," I began, my voice steady, though the unease gnawed at me from the inside. "But something is out there. We need everyone to stay inside, lock your doors, and don't go out alone." A voice from the back of the room spoke up. "What about the bear patrols?" "We haven't seen any bears near town," I replied, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "But we're keeping an eye out. Dana, Carl, and I will be doing regular rounds." The meeting broke up quickly, the townsfolk eager to get back to the safety of their homes. But we all knew that safety was a fragile thing now. It was a week later when things finally broke. The night was colder than usual, the kind of bitter cold that froze your breath the moment you exhaled. The sky was black, not a sliver of moon, just endless, smothering darkness. I was in my office, going over the coastline maps, trying to connect the dots on the disappearances, trying to find a pattern. When the power went out, the comforting hum of the heater died, and the station was plunged into silence, an eerie, suffocating stillness. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out into the hallway, where Carl and Dana were already waiting. "Power's out all over town," Dana said, her breath visible in the air. "We've got a report of something moving near the northern edge." "All right, let's go check it out," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. Carl nodded, his jaw set, face tense. "Hannah Damon has been calling again. She's asking about Charlie. If we're not going to find him, she says she'll go out and look for him herself." I cursed under my breath. "All right, I'll swing by her place first. Grab your rifles." We split up, me heading north, while Dana and Carl covered the town. The wind howled, pushing snow in thick, swirling gusts down the empty streets. My flashlight flickered in the cold, casting long shadows as I made my way toward the Damon house. When I arrived, the door was ajar, swaying gently in the wind. The house was dark, save for the beam of my flashlight. The kitchen was empty, a half-finished meal sitting untouched on the table. But the back door, it had been ripped off its hinges, splintered and jagged. My stomach clenched, bracing for what I knew was coming. And then I saw it, there in the snow outside, a trail of blood. I followed the blood through the snow, my breath coming out in heavy clouded bursts. The wind seemed to carry whispers, like the town itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I could feel the weight of the darkness pressing down on me. For the first time I felt small out here, exposed. The trail of blood led me to a small clearing near the coastline, where the frozen sea met the land in jagged sheets of ice. My flashlight flickered, casting ghostly shadows over the snow. And then I saw her. Hannah was lying face down in the snow, her body twisted in unnatural angles. Her clothes were torn to shreds, and blood pooled around her, soaking into the frozen earth. but she was still breathing. Barely. I rushed to her side, gently turning her over. Her face was deathly pale, her lips tinged blue, eyes wide with shock. She tried to speak, but all that escaped was a gurgling rasp as blood bubbled up from a wound in her chest. A chunk of flesh had been torn from her neck. "Help," she gasped, her half-missing hand clutching my arm with surprising strength. It's still here." I scanned the area but saw nothing. Just the endless, empty stretch of snow and ice. "What did this to you, Hannah?" I asked, trying to steady my voice. "What happened?" But she didn't respond. Her eyes glazed over and her hand went limp. I cursed under my breath, scanning my surroundings. No tracks, no sign of whatever had attacked her, but I could feel it. Something was out there, watching. I quickly radioed Dana and Carl, my voice low. "I found Hannah. She's dead. Whatever did this, it's close." "We're on our way," Carl replied, his voice distant, hollow. "Stay put." But I couldn't stay put. Not with whatever was out there, picking us off one by one. By the time Carl and Dana arrived, the wind had picked up, howling through the streets like a wild animal. We wrapped Hannah's body in a tarp, working together in grim silence. I could see Carl was rattled. He'd been the one to find Sam Walsh, and this second body was beginning to take its toll on him. "We need to stop this thing," Dana said quietly, barely audible over the wind. "Whatever it is." Carl shook his head. "This doesn't make sense, Chief." "I know it doesn't make sense," I said, my voice tight. "Animals don't act like this." Dana's hand rested nervously on her rifle. "Then what the hell is it?" I had no answer. But deep down, a primal fear stirred within me, a fear that went beyond anything rational. There was something out there, hunting us, and it wasn't going to stop. The next day, panic swept through the town. People raided Sam's general store, barricading their homes and arming themselves with whatever they could find. The streets were empty, save for the occasional snowmobile darting from one house to the next. But no one knew what they were running from. They only knew that something was out there, and it was coming for them. I spent the morning going door to door with Carl and Dana, checking on the townspeople, trying to calm them down and assure them we were doing everything we could. But fear had taken root. People weren't thinking clearly. They were acting out of pure desperation. At one house, old Mrs. Kaufman opened the door, gripping a shotgun. Her eyes were wide with terror. "You're not gonna let it get me, are you, Sheriff?" she asked, her hands shaking as she held the gun. "I've been hearing things, scratching at my walls at night." I placed a hand on her shoulder, trying to offer some comfort. "We're doing everything we can, Mrs. Kaufman. Stay inside, lock your doors, and don't go out alone. We'll figure this out." But even as I spoke the words, doubt crept into my mind. I wasn't sure I believed them myself. That night, sleep eluded me. My mind kept replaying the events, trying to piece it all together. Whatever was out there, it was intelligent and strong. When the first few bodies vanished, I had thought it was just a predator picking off lone victims in the dark. Wolves, maybe? But lately it seemed like the killings were senseless. The victims weren't being taken for food. It didn't make sense. Was it some animal, or something, or someone from the town? The next morning, I sat at my desk, staring out at the inky blackness. The radio next to me crackled to life, Dana's voice cutting through the static. "Tom, I've got movement near the old school building. I'm going to check it out." My heart skipped a beat. "Wait for backup," I said, grabbing my coat. "I'll meet you there." But by the time I reached the school, it was already too late. The building was old, abandoned after the new school had been built across town. Most people avoided it, saying it was haunted or cursed. The local kids would dare each other to go inside, but none ever stayed long. There was just something off about the place. I pulled up to the front, the wind biting at my face, snow stinging my skin. The door was ajar, swinging with the gusts. I stepped inside, flashlight in hand, casting long, eerie shadows across the empty hallways. "Dana?" I called, my voice echoing through the silence. No answer. I moved deeper into the building, my pulse quickening. The floor creaked under my boots and the cold seeped into my bones. Something wasn't right. I could feel it. Then I heard it. A low, guttural growl coming from somewhere down the hall. My stomach dropped. For a brief moment I froze, caught in a primal fear like a mouse encountering a predator. But I knew I had no choice. I had to keep going. Raising my rifle, I moved cautiously toward the sound. My flashlight flickered, the beam cutting through the darkness. Then I saw it. For the first time, I saw it. At first, I thought it was just a shadow, some trick of the light. But as I approached, the reality of what I was seeing hit me. The creature was massive, its fur as white as the snow outside. It was so large, I thought my eyes were deceiving me. Its eyes were black and hollow, filled with an unnatural hunger. It stood on all fours, its massive paws tipped with claws the size of my forearm. Blood stained the white fur around its jaws. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. I didn't know what to do, or where to go. It was a polar bear, but not like any I had ever seen. The creature was colossal, larger than any polar bear I'd ever heard of. It looked like it had emerged straight from a nightmare, a twisted, monstrous version of its real counterpart. Its eyes locked onto mine, and for a brief moment, we stood motionless, sizing each other up. Then it charged, faster than I could have imagined, lunging at me with a roar that shook the walls. I fired. The rifle's shot was deafening in the enclosed space, but the bullet barely seemed to slow it down. In an instant, the bear was on me, knocking me to the ground. Its jaws snapped inches from my face. I scrambled back, kicking at the creature, but it swiped at me with one enormous paw. Its claws shredded through my coat as if it were paper, throwing me aside like a rag doll. My rifle clattered to the floor. Useless. I reached for my sidearm, fumbling with the holster as the bear lunged again. This time, I managed to roll away just in time, firing 2 shots into its side. The bear let out a deafening roar and staggered back, but it wasn't even close to being done. It wasn't going to stop. Blood oozed from a gash in my arm as I stumbled to my feet. The bear circled me, its black eyes locking onto mine. I could see the intelligence in those eyes, the way it sized me up, calculating, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. My heart pounded in my ears as I backed away, every nerve on edge. Its breath came in thick clouds, steam rising in the cold air. The stench of blood hung heavy, thickening the atmosphere. My hand was slick with sweat, gripping my sidearm, trying to steady my aim. The bear knew what I was planning, and it could tell it held the advantage. In the fleeting moments I had to think, my mind raced. This creature had killed my friends, my townspeople. It wasn't going to stop until we were all dead. I couldn't die here, not like this, in the decaying halls of an abandoned school. I fired again, aiming for its head. The bullet grazed its skull, and for a split second, I thought I had done it. The bear staggered, letting out a low growl as it shook its head, disoriented. But I didn't wait. I turned and ran, my boots pounding on the floor as I raced for the exit. The wind howled as I burst through the doors, the cold biting into my skin like 1,000 needles. Behind me, I heard the bear recovering, crashing through the building, its massive form ripping through doors and walls in pursuit. It was faster than I could have ever imagined, and I knew I didn't have much time. I didn't stop running until I reached the snowmobile. The engine sputtered to life just as the bear tore through the front of the school, a blur of fur and fury. I gunned the throttle, speeding off into the darkness as fast as the machine could go, the bear's roar fading behind me. When I reached the station, Carl and Dana were waiting for me, pale and shaken. The look in their eyes told me everything I needed to know. Dana had made it to the school first, but she had lost her radio in the chaos and couldn't warn me. "What the hell was that thing?" Dana asked, her voice trembling. "That wasn't a normal bear." "I don't know," I replied, still trying to catch my breath. "But it's hunting us, and it's not going to stop. It's not killing for food, it's killing for sport." Carl stood by the window, gazing out into the night. "Great. A huge rogue polar bear. We need to warn the town, get everyone out of its way." "There's no safety," I said, the enormity of the situation pressing down on me. "Not with that thing out there." The office phone rang. One of the townsfolk was on the other end. "Chief, there's something ripping through the streets. It's... oh, God." The transmission cut off with a scream, followed by the unmistakable sound of someone being torn apart. "We need to act," Carl said, grabbing his rifle. "We can't just sit here." "I know," I replied, grabbing my own rifle and heading for the door. "But we can't fight it out in the open like this. We need to draw it somewhere, trap it, and kill it." "Where?" Dana asked, her eyes wide with fear. I paused, my mind racing, and then it clicked. The police station. Thick walls, steel doors, an arsenal of weapons. If we could lure the bear here, we might stand a chance. A slim one, but better than nothing. We bring it here, I said, a plan taking shape in my mind. We lock it in, and we kill it. The town felt deathly still as we rode out, the streets abandoned except for fleeting shadows that flickered in the corners of our vision. Most of the townspeople had barricaded themselves inside their homes, but I knew it wouldn't help them. If that bear wanted in, nothing would stop it. It was a living nightmare, and it was hunting. We drove through town, past bloodstains and debris left from previous attacks. At every turn, I had the unnerving feeling of being watched, like the darkness itself was waiting to strike. But there was no sign of the bear, not yet. When we reached the center of town, we stopped. The plan was simple: make enough noise to draw the bear out, then lead it back to the station. Easy in theory, but I wasn't naive enough to think it would go smoothly. Carl fired a shot into the air, the sound reverberating through the empty streets. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, from the distance, the unmistakable growl reached us, low and threatening. The bear was coming. "Get ready," I said, my heart pounding in my chest. The growling grew louder and closer. My hands shook as I raised my rifle, scanning the darkness for any movement. And then it appeared, emerging from the shadows like a ghost, its massive white form blending with the snow. Its eyes glinted in the dim light, locked onto us with a terrifying focus. The bear roared, a sound that vibrated through the ground beneath our feet. It charged toward us, moving faster than I thought possible. We turned and ran, leading it toward the station. I could hear its heavy steps echoing behind us, the ground shaking with every pound of its paws. It was close. Too close.
We reached the station just in time. Carl and Dana rushed inside, and I slammed the door shut behind us. The bear crashed against the steel, the sound reverberating throughout the building. It roared again, clawing at the door, desperately trying to get inside. "We need to hold it here," I said, my voice strained with fear. "We can't let it break through." For hours, the bear prowled around the station, growling and scratching at the walls. Occasionally, it would slam its massive body into the building, shaking the very foundations. We barricaded ourselves in the main office, the only room with reinforced walls, but even that felt as if it might not withstand for long. Carl sat by the window, his rifle trained on the door. Dana paced nervously, her hands trembling. The fear in the air was suffocating, and I could feel it creeping into all of us. We were trapped, with no way out and no clear idea of how to kill the beast. "We're running out of time," Dana whispered, her voice shaky. "If we don't do something soon." "I know," I replied, my mind working frantically. "But we can't face it head on. We need to figure out a way to trap it." The plan was risky, but it was our only option. We set up a makeshift barricade in the hallway leading to the main office, hoping to funnel the bear into a narrow space where we could take a clean shot. I knew it wouldn't be enough to kill it, but it might slow it down. We waited, the tension thick and unbearable. Every minute felt like an eternity, and the bear's growls outside made my skin crawl. Then, suddenly, the door burst open with a deafening crash, and the bear charged in, a blur of fur and teeth. It was even larger than I remembered, its eyes gleaming with a dark intelligence. It moved with unnerving speed, barreling toward us, smashing through the barricade with ease. I raised my rifle and fired, hitting the bear square in the chest. It barely flinched, the impact absorbed by its massive form as it continued its charge. Carl fired too, but the bullets seemed to do little more than enrage the beast. The bear lunged at Carl, its jaws snapping shut around his arm with a sickening crunch. He screamed, blood spraying across the walls as the bear shook him violently. Dana fired repeatedly, but it was already too late. Carl was gone. The bear tossed Carl's lifeless body aside like a rag doll, the sickening sound of his broken bones echoing through the hallway. Dana screamed in terror, her voice cracking as she scrambled to reload her gun, but her hands were shaking so badly that she fumbled the bullets. I could see the panic in her eyes, her mind desperately searching for a way out, but there was no escape. The bear turned toward us, its eyes burning with malice, as if it knew we were trapped. Blood dripped from its mouth, pooling on the floor and mixing with Carl's remains. Its breath came in heavy puffs, and the stench of death filled the air. "Dana, move," I shouted, pulling her back just as the bear lunged.
Its claws scraped the floor where Dana had been standing just moments before, the sound like nails dragging across a chalkboard. We stumbled backward, retreating into the office and slamming the door shut behind us. The bear roared, its massive body crashing against the reinforced door. The frame groaned under the force, and I knew it wouldn't hold for much longer. Dana huddled in the corner, her face streaked with tears, her breath shallow and panicked. We can't kill it?" she whimpered, clutching her gun as though it were the only thing keeping her from losing her mind. It's not just a bear. "We have to try," I replied, though I didn't believe my own words. There was no reasoning with this creature. It wasn't just a predator, it was something far worse, something feral and unstoppable, as if the very laws of nature had betrayed us. The door groaned, buckling under the bear's relentless assault. I knew we had only moments before it gave way completely. My mind raced, scanning the room for anything that could help, something to slow the beast down. My eyes fell on a small metal cabinet in the corner, one I knew contained the emergency shotgun and extra shells. Without a second thought, I yanked it open, grabbed the shotgun, and slammed shells into it. The door was starting to crack, splinters flying as the bear's claws tore into the wood. We watched in terror as the beast forced its way through, its jaws snapping at the air as it pushed its massive head into the broken doorframe. I fired, the shotgun blast hitting the bear square in the face. It recoiled with a deafening roar, but the shot had no effect. The pellets barely grazed its thick fur and muscle. It only made it angrier. With a final, furious push, the door gave way completely, and the bear charged into the room, knocking desks and filing cabinets aside like they were nothing. I kept firing, pumping round after round into it, but the beast didn't stop. It just kept coming. "Go! Run!" I yelled at Dana, shoving her toward the far side of the room. She hesitated for a split second before dashing for the door. I fired one last shot at the bear's head, buying myself a few seconds, and then I followed her. We sprinted through the back hallways of the station, the bear's heavy footfalls thundering behind us. Each step it took seemed to shake the ground beneath us. My lungs burned with the cold air, and my legs felt like lead, but I couldn't afford to stop. Not now. Dana and I burst into the storage room, our last refuge. It was a large windowless space, cluttered with old evidence boxes, shelves, and rusted lockers. There was nowhere else to run. The bear would tear this place apart. We closed the door silently behind us. "We can't keep running," I whispered, breathless. "We have to end this." "How?" Dana cried, her voice rising in hysteria. "We've shot it. We've tried to trap it. Nothing's worked. It's gonna kill us." I didn't have an answer, but there was one last thing I hadn't tried. Something that might just be enough to take the bear down for good. In the far corner of the room, behind a pile of old supplies, sat a single, rusting gas canister. It was a remnant from when the station had been heated by a backup generator, long before the system was upgraded. It was old, likely unstable, but it was our last hope. I grabbed the canister and struggled to drag it across the room. Dana's eyes widened in realization as she watched me. "Oh, great idea. You're gonna blow us all up," she said, her voice laced with fear and disbelief. "Not if we do it right," I replied. "We can't kill this thing with bullets, but we sure as hell can burn it alive." Outside the door, we heard the heavy footsteps approaching. I raised a finger to my lips, hoping for a moment that the bear wouldn't find us. My hope was in vain, as the bear roared again, slamming its massive body into the door of the storage room, shaking the walls. It wouldn't be long now. "Get out through the crawl space," I said, pointing to the small hatch in the corner. "I'll keep it here, lure it close enough to the gas. Once you're outside, I'll blow this place sky high." Dana froze for a moment, then nodded, her resolve hardening. She hurried to the crawl space, opened the hatch, and squeezed herself through the narrow opening. The moment she disappeared from sight, the bear crashed through the door. It stood in the doorway, panting, its eyes locking onto mine with a feral hunger. I took a step back, holding the shotgun in one hand and the gas canister in the other. "Come on, you big bastard," I muttered. The bear charged, and I didn't hesitate. I threw the canister toward the creature, then raised the shotgun, aiming for the gas. The bear lunged at me just as I pulled the trigger. The explosion rocked the station, fire and debris filling the air in a deafening roar. The heat hit me like a freight train, knocking the breath out of me and slamming me against the far wall. For a moment, I couldn't breathe, couldn't see anything through the smoke and flames. My ears rang, my vision blurred. But then I saw it. The bear, or what was left of it. Its massive body was engulfed in flames, thrashing wildly as it let out one final agonized roar. The fire consumed it, scorching its fur and charring its flesh as it writhed in agony. I could feel the searing heat on my skin, the thick smoke choking my lungs, but I didn't move. I simply watched, numb, as the bear collapsed into a smoldering heap. It was over. I made my way outside, where Dana was waiting. We stood together in silence, watching the flames consume the station, leaving nothing but scorched ruins and the acrid stench of burnt flesh. Her hands trembled as she helped steady me, her voice barely above a whisper. "You did it," she said hoarsely. "You actually killed it." I nodded, but there was no sense of victory in me. The weight of everything we had lost, Carl, the townspeople, pressed down on my chest like a crushing stone. It was too much to carry. As we stood in the ruins, I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that we hadn't seen the end of it. What if there were more like that, waiting out there, hidden in the shadows? Next time, we might not be so lucky. The long, endless nights of Alaska had always been part of life in Barrow, but now, they would never feel the same. Not after what we had witnessed, what we had survived. The sun rose a few weeks later, but for me, the shadows would always remain. They lingered just out of sight, a constant presence in my mind. The polar night would begin again next month, and I needed to be ready. My phone buzzes beside my armchair. It's him again. He usually says it's just to check in. I think about seeing if the call recording app is running, but it doesn't seem worth the effort. I've tried to capture his calls dozens of times, but every attempt has failed. When I listen back, I hear my own voice, but any response from him is just a wall of static. The call log never shows that I received anything from him, and my cell carrier's records are always empty when I ask them. For an old man, his tech skills are remarkable. 6 years ago, when I retired from the force, he was still the prime suspect in one of my oldest and most frustrating unsolved cases. I call him the Mimic. He kills 3 people, once a month, for 3 months, using the methods of some of the most infamous serial killers in history. After that, he vanishes for 9 months. When he returns, it's in a new city across the state. Sometimes he disappears for a year or 2, but he always comes back, and he never stops calling. Tension builds in my temples as I answer and press the phone to my ear. "Hello." "Merry Christmas, Detective Coates," comes the calm voice on the other end. He calls several times a year, and every time I dread it. His voice always sounds like an old friend. "How have you been? Is retirement treating you well?" "I'm about the same as the last time you called," I reply. I may as well talk to him. He'll just keep calling if I don't. "Retirement's not too restful with you still out there. Maybe one of these days I'll change that. I'm sure half a dozen state prisons would love to give you a cozy room and 3 hot meals a day. Just tell me where you are, Alistar, and I'll drop you off myself." His voice bursts into gleeful laughter. His name's Alistar Lynch, I think, though I can't be certain. A rare book dealer by that name disappeared in 1986, the same year the Mimic claimed his first victims. Alistar liquidated his estate, drained his bank accounts, and vanished without a trace. How did I make the connection? I hate to admit it, but he told me himself. I was still a rookie, only 2 years into my career. Dennis Garrison, a veteran detective, had pulled me into the case. On my first week, Alistar called and introduced himself. By then, he'd been active for over 5 years, and we were no closer to catching him than we were when his cycle started. He told me boredom was his motive for revealing himself. He thought that maybe, if we knew who he was, we could give him more of a challenge. "Bartholomew," he purrs through the phone. "I told you where I was 2 years ago, and I tried my best to meet you. All I asked was that you didn't call the police, but you didn't listen. Instead of talking face to face, I had to take care of the 2 officers you sent to the location. Why should I trust you again? You'd just end up with more blood on your hands." A sour knot tightens in my stomach at the mention of the fallen officers. 2 years ago, Alistar called and suggested a meeting. He wanted to meet the man who had spent years chasing him, and maybe he'd even let me take him into custody. On one condition. No police. 4 years into retirement, the habits of my training still clung to me like tar on a roof. Of course, I wanted to catch Alistar. He had evaded justice for nearly 4 decades. But going alone to meet a self-confessed serial killer was madness. I knew I was past my prime. Even if I managed to arrest him, I had no authority. The arrest wouldn't stick. What if I botched it after all these years of chasing him, and the monster walked free? I decided to call the state police and give them the time and place. Better to let the young officers handle it. The officer I called was Walter Dempsey, an old friend and a hard-nosed detective who was nearing retirement. Walter tried to reassure me that someone was just playing a cruel joke, but I insisted that our prime suspect would be there. Everyone at my old precinct knew about my phone calls, but the lack of call logs or recordings made them skeptical. And I understood. Some retired cops can't let go. They try to stay relevant by reaching out to old colleagues. Walter thought it might just be some prank call from a kid. Some of the younger guys thought I was losing it. Maybe they were right, but not about the calls. Still, Walter agreed to take a young patrolman, Vincent Harris, with him to the location. He said it was a courtesy for my years of service. Later, I found out that Walter never even entered it in the patrol log. He didn't take it seriously enough to make it official. No one knew where they went. Hours after they were supposed to call back, I hadn't heard from either of them. My repeated calls and texts went unanswered. Panicking, I called the patrol post. No one had heard from Dempsey or Harris. Their shift had ended, but their patrol vehicles never checked back in. Attempts to contact them on the cruiser radio went unanswered. I spoke to the post captain, and after hearing about my conversation with Dempsey, he sent 5 units to the derelict warehouse where Alistar had agreed to meet. Unlike Walter, they were heavily armed and in greater numbers. I don't think the captain believed me, but he was wise enough not to take chances. They found the patrol car outside. Inside, they found a bloodbath. Both men were kneeling in the middle of a filthy room, shot execution style in the back of their heads. They had been disemboweled post-mortem. Their blood had pooled around them in a horrifying crimson disk. A message had been scrawled on the floor, traced with the vile runoff. "Bart Coates, I just wanted to talk. Now look what you made me do. Shame. Shame, old man." That day, I told myself that if I ever had the chance again, I'd meet him alone. Following protocol had led to the deaths of 2 brave men, just doing a retired detective a favor. They probably thought it would be a small bit of post-end-of-watch comfort for me. This was the first time since their deaths that Alistar had even responded to the idea of meeting. Sleep rarely comes to me anymore. When it does, I'm haunted by the images of Dempsey and Harris, accusing me of sending them to their deaths. I have to make this work. "I'll meet you, Alistar," I say, my voice steady. "Name the time and place. No cops. I can't bear the weight of another death. We're not young men anymore. I'm pushing 60, and you've got a decade on me. Aren't you getting tired?" Silence on the other end fills my mind with dread. "Alistar?" I ask again, tension creeping into my voice. "I'll meet you, just..." "Fine, Bartholomew," he finally responds, his voice like gravel. "Meet me at this address, and we'll have a little chat. Got a pen and paper?" I scribble the address down and hang up, the weight of the decision sinking in. I drive to a long-abandoned gas station, 4 miles outside of town. A sign, shaking in the wind, advertises fuel prices that haven't been seen in over 20 years. A relic of the past, I think to myself. It's almost poetic that he chose this place. Once useful, now decaying and forgotten, just like everything else. The pumps are rusting away, flakes peeling off like old skin. The windows, thick with dirt and grime, block my headlights from penetrating the darkness inside. This place is a testament to time's ravages, a symbol of everything that's fallen apart. The bright yellow sheet of legal paper taped to one of the windows catches my eye like a beacon. I step out of my car, my hand instinctively reaching for the Glock 22 holstered beneath my jacket. The weight of the weapon offers a brief moment of comfort. I know I shouldn't be here, but finding a resolution is all I have left. By the end of this night, either I'll have him or he'll have me. Either way, the phone calls will stop. As soon as I spot him, I'll put a bullet in his head and one in his heart. One for Dempsey, one for Harris. If I succeed, I'll place the empty shells on their gravestones. I pull the gun from its holster and switch off the safety, my every step crunching against the debris-strewn parking lot. I scan the area as I move toward the note, but see no sign of anyone. The gas station, like a long-dead corpse, stands abandoned, save for the fluttering yellow sheet of paper. My blood runs cold as I reach for the note and pull it from the window. The flowing cursive is immaculate, smooth, almost elegant. For an older man, his hand is surprisingly steady. Bartholomew, if you're reading this, then you've shown up just as the good detective I've always hoped you were. I'm sorry if you're disappointed not to find me here. I haven't backed out of our deal, but I wanted to be sure you were alone this time. While I wouldn't mind dispatching a few more of your old friends, I'd much prefer meeting you face to face. As you read this, I'm watching you from a great distance down the road. Night vision scopes have come a long way. Don't worry, I wouldn't shoot you. What a cowardly, anticlimactic end that would be to our little game. Get back in your car and flash your high beams 3 times, so I know you've read this. Wait for 3 flashes in return, and then head down the gravel road in the direction of the light. The words linger in my mind as I digest the message. He's not here. He's watching me. I can almost feel his eyes on me, cold and calculating. The paper stiffens in my hand as I read the final lines, then crumple it into a tight ball. If you continue past the beacon for 3 miles, you will see a hunting cabin. Come inside. You can bring your gun. I know you have one. It won't keep you safe. Your friend, Alistair Lynch. I throw the paper aside and sit back in the car. My heart is pounding in my chest, but there's no turning back now. I turn the ignition and the engine roars to life. I twist the light control knob 3 times, sending a brief burst of illumination across the desolate field. The dry grass sways in the breeze, and I spot the gleaming yellow eyes of nocturnal creatures reflecting in the light. Then, just as quickly, everything goes dark again. The only light now comes from the weak flickering glow of my dashboard. Sweat drips down my neck. It's not even that hot. But the tension, the creeping sensation that he's watching me, sends a chill through my spine. I can almost feel his gaze through his night vision. A brilliant beam of light cuts through the darkness, briefly illuminating the world ahead. It vanishes as quickly as it appears, followed by another, then a third. He's out there, watching. I shift the car into drive and begin rolling down the gravel road toward the beacon, my tires crunching against the gravel like half-hearted gunfire. The field around me stretches out, and those yellow eyes, dozens of them, stare back at me, unblinking. I feel it, the weight of something malevolent, pulling the darkness around it. He's drawn them all to him. Every animal, every dark creature, every shadow seems to know his presence. The air fills with distant yips and howls. At first they're chilling, ominous, but soon they take on a mournful quality, as if they're warning me. Turn back. Death is waiting. I slam my hand against the horn, sending a sharp, high-pitched wail into the night. The yellow eyes scatter, dissolving back into the darkness, and the air quiets. The eerie silence settles in once more, only the sound of my tires crunching against gravel breaking it. I finally pull over, stopping where the light had flashed from. Lying in the grass is a floodlight, a night vision scope without a rifle, and a tattered paperback. With my foot, I nudge the book over. The cover shows a crimson horse with bold yellow words floating above its head, "The Catcher in the Rye." I let out a bitter laugh. While I've been creeping through the darkness, contemplating my life, and wondering if this night would be my last, Alistair Lynch had been sitting right here, casually reading a book. It feels absurd. Everything that's led up to this moment, the tension, the violence, the years of haunting, and yet here he is, this murderous old man, reading a paperback in the dark. I kick the book aside into the thick grass and slide back into the car. The night vision scope catches my eye, but I leave it behind. It would be too risky. If he kills me, or if he escapes, this will be the first physical evidence of his existence in years. And I'm not going to make it any easier for him to disappear again. I know better than to leave my prints on that scope. The car rolls forward, the engine's hum filling the silence, but my heart feels as if it's going to burst from my chest. It's still a ways off, but the headlights catch something in the distance, a silhouette standing tall against the inky blackness. A cabin. Alone on a small hill, the cabin seems like a fortress in the dark. and inside, an evil man waiting for me. My mind is spinning, fear clawing at the edges of my thoughts, urging me to flee, turn around. It's not too late, but I can't. I'm too close now. If I leave, he'll never agree to meet again. No, I'm already here. There's no turning back. I can't let fear control me. He'll kill you. Is that what you want? You're no hero, Bart Coates. Maybe he will, I think, but I'll try to kill him first, and if he does, so be it. This is a trap, Bart. Do you think he'll let you take him to the authorities? I don't think so. But it's too late. The car crests a small incline, tires crunching on the gravel as it moves onto a packed dirt pullover. I'm here. Just 50 feet from the cabin now. The structure is falling apart. Shutters dangle from the sides, rotting under the sun. The windows are shattered, jagged glass biting into the air. The roof is pockmarked with holes, and the sagging rafters beneath look ready to collapse. The front door is shut, but through one of the broken windows, I see a figure. I cut the ignition, my hands shaking as I step out of the car. The dry autumn air fills my lungs, mixed with the musty scent of old wood. The night is cool, but a deep chill seeps into my bones. Decades of work, of following clues, of chasing ghosts, and it all leads me here, to this decaying cabin on a hill. Then, the sound of a rusty door swinging open pierces the air. Without hesitation, I raise my .22 and fire 3 quick shots at the opening. My heart pounds in my ears as I wait for a response. The darkness makes it hard to focus. Did I hit him?
Whoa there! Alistar calls out from the cabin, his voice mocking. I thought we were going to talk. That's no way to start a conversation, my old friend. Alistar Lynch, I call, my voice steady despite the pounding in my chest. Step out with your hands in the air. Fine, fine. His voice chirps, almost gleeful. Have it your way, Bartholomew. Cross my heart, I'll do as you've asked. My eyes adjust to the dark, and I can make out the tall, thin figure of a man in the doorway. His arms are unnaturally long, almost brushing the frame of the door. A cold sweat spills into my eyes as I pull the trigger 3 more times. The shots land center mass, but Alistar doesn't even flinch. He doesn't move. The sirens in my head scream at me to get in the car, to leave, to run. But I can't. Not now. I pull the trigger again and again, until there's nothing but a hollow click. Still he stands there, untouched, unhurt. I told you your little toy wouldn't keep you safe. He says, his voice dripping with sarcasm. I've met you here in good faith, yet you try to shoot me down like a rabid dog. Shame, Bart, shame. My mind is reeling. I'm dizzy. My stomach churns as panic sets in. What's happening? I should have hit him. I know I should have. I'm feeling a bit angry now, Detective. Alistar continues, his tone darkening. Last chance to come inside and speak. If you want answers, you'd better come inside. I won't be here for long. If you keep misbehaving, you may not be either. The figure vanishes into the darkness of the house, leaving me frozen, staring at the empty doorway. I stumble, fumbling for my car keys. My hands are shaking as I back away from the cabin, toward the car. I reach for the door handle, ready to bolt, to escape. I thought it was too late to turn back. But now I'm not sure what I'm even facing. This wasn't what I expected. I can't hurt him. I can't even touch him. Or is it something else entirely? The shadow looms, its presence suffocating the air around me. Every inch of my body is frozen with fear, but something compels me to stay. I want to scream, but my voice is trapped in my throat, too terrified to escape. Alistar, or whatever this thing is, speaks again, its voice shifting, sounding as if it's everywhere, inside my head, under my skin, in the very space around us. I've watched humanity for centuries, Detective, it continues, its voice filling every crevice of the room. Your crimes, your sins, they amuse me, they entertain me. The darker your world becomes, the more I feed on it. But now, I wish to retire. You and I, we are not so different. You hunt, you track, and you call yourself a seeker of truth. But I am the end of that truth. The room seems to close in around me as the darkness presses closer. The thing takes on a form, a shape, but it remains more terrifying than anything I could have ever imagined.
It's not just a figure. It's the very concept of inevitability, of fate, a being that was never meant to be understood. You've always known, Bart, it says as if reading my thoughts. You know what I am. You've been chasing me for years, hoping to capture me, hoping to trap me in your small mortal world. But here I am, and now I am here to claim you, just as I will claim all those who come after you. My mind races. No, this can't be real. It can't. I reach for my gun, my fingers trembling, but my body refuses to obey. The fear, the terror, it's overwhelming, suffocating. I'm not ready, I whisper, but even I don't know what I mean by that. The thing tilts its head, its form shifting ever so slightly, like a shadow caught in the wind. You never are, it responds. No one is ready. That is the gift I give to all, whether you beg for it or not. I feel something pulling at me, a tug in my chest. I don't want to die. I don't want to face this thing. But I know I don't have a choice, not anymore. Please, I beg, my voice a mere rasp. What do you want from me? I want you to understand, the thing replies, its voice eerily calm. You have spent your life chasing something that can never be caught, but now you will see. The final truth, the last moment, the moment when you meet me. The room seems to grow darker still. The candles flicker violently, as if struggling against an invisible force. The air grows colder, and I feel the creeping cold of death seeping into my very bones. I try to look away to escape, but there is nowhere to run. There is no escape. I am waiting, Bart, the thing whispers, its voice now a haunting melody echoing in the empty space. Step into the darkness, and let me show you the final end. I close my eyes, my body trembling, but no matter how hard I try, I cannot escape. The dark presence lingers, heavy, inevitable. I stare at myself, my heart hammering against my ribs. The gray fingerprint on my forehead feels as though it's burned into my skin, its presence undeniable and horrifying. My breath catches in my throat as I slowly move closer to the mirror, unable to tear my eyes away from the sight. My reflection is wrong, distorted, and unfamiliar. My pupils are gone, replaced by an endless empty void, like two dark holes swallowing every speck of light. It's not possible. It's not real. I blink rapidly, trying to clear the darkness from my vision, but it only grows deeper. The edges of my reflection seem to blur, as though I'm losing myself in the glass, becoming one with the shadows. I reach out with trembling fingers, pressing them to the mirror. The cold surface sends a shock of ice through my skin, but it does nothing to stop the feeling creeping over me, like something is waiting, watching from within the reflection. Something is moving behind my eyes, and it's not me. Panic claws at my throat. I try to speak, to scream, but no sound comes. The weight of the void presses harder, suffocating me, pulling me deeper into the abyss. Bartholomew, a voice whispers from the darkness behind me, its tone deep and rich with an eerie familiarity. I told you, the light of life is fading. Your days are few. The voice, it's Alistar, or whatever that thing is that took his form. It's not just a nightmare then, it's real, it's happening, and it's not over. I whip around, but the room is empty. The night is still, unnaturally silent. I can hear nothing except my ragged breathing and the frantic beating of my heart, but something lingers, something intangible, like a shadow at the edge of my vision. I feel its presence pressing against me, almost as if it's inside me now, a part of me. I stagger back from the mirror, my mind racing. What the hell is happening? What did I just see? Am I losing my mind, or is this something far worse than any madness I've ever known? I stumble toward the door, but my feet feel heavy, like they're sinking into the floor. My head is pounding so hard I think it might split open. Every movement is sluggish, as though my body is fighting against itself. But then I hear it again, that whisper, closer now. I will come for you soon, Bartholomew, and when I do, you will join me. You will become me. The voice is so close, I can almost feel it brushing against my skin. With a final surge of adrenaline, I rush out of the bathroom, my hands trembling as I grab the nearest object, anything to defend myself from the darkness that is coming for me. But nothing makes sense anymore. The world feels distorted, like a dream slipping away, just as I try to grasp it. The walls seem to pulse and warp, as if they're alive, shifting around me. I glance back toward the mirror, but I can't bear to look at it again. What I saw there is following me, and the worst part? I know, deep down, that it's only the beginning. I'm a police officer, and I've been serving for about 5 years now. After completing 2 years at the academy and going through probation, I've spent the last 3 years patrolling the streets. I'm partnered with a longtime friend from middle school, and we've been serving the same area together for all this time. We recently spent 2 months working in the department's crime suppression division due to the recent protests that had been going on. But now, we're back in our regular patrol area, the quieter, more secluded part of the city where we first started. For the sake of privacy and following department policies, I won't be revealing which department we work for, the city, or any personal information about people or addresses involved in this story. So to keep it general, I'll just say that we patrol a fairly calm area, although, like most police officers, we still encounter our share of strange, unsettling calls. It was a Thursday evening, and my partner and I were on the night shift, starting at 6 p.m. The night watch crew, wrapping up their shift, exchanged their usual banter with us as we checked the car for any items or paperwork that may have been missed. The vehicle was clear, and we radioed our supervisor to officially begin our patrol. Now, I want to emphasize that we work in a relatively quiet area. There are no major incidents or high crime zones in our patrol area, but that doesn't mean we don't get the occasional weird or unsettling call. As we settled into the shift, everything felt pretty routine. We were just cruising around, getting through some paperwork, and listening to the radio chatter. At times, we'd share a few laughs, especially when one of our fellow officers got hit with a particularly unpleasant assignment. I guess that's the camaraderie that comes with the job. But little did we know, things were about to take a strange turn. It was just around 9:45 p.m. when the call came through. The radio was quiet for a few moments, allowing us to focus on the work at hand. But then there it was. The usual static crackled, and we heard the dispatch call come through. I can't share the full details, but this is basically how it went down. 16 Adam 59, woman at 12 Hoshaw Foothill reports possible 602, no suspect description available. Code 2, incident 8448, RD 643. For anyone not familiar with the jargon, 602 refers to trespassing, and Code 2 means a response with no sirens or lights, meaning the situation isn't considered urgent enough for emergency attention. It's a standard protocol when the dispatcher believes the situation doesn't pose an immediate danger to life or property. 16 Adam 59 Roger, show us en route, I responded as I tapped the radio mic. My partner and I exchanged glances. $20 says it's her ex-boyfriend, I said, half joking. I've got your 20 right here, my partner shot back with a smirk. 25 says it's a neighbor with a prior. We were already anticipating the type of call it would be. Trespassing calls like this were pretty routine. Most of the time, it involved some annoyed neighbor or an ex-partner showing up at someone's door. But there was something about this one that made it feel different. Maybe it was the timing, or maybe just that we had been working these kinds of cases for so long that we started to develop an intuition for what might come next. Either way, we had no idea that this was going to turn into one of the strangest experiences of our careers. As we turned the corner, I flicked off the headlights, and Mark, my partner, steered the car slowly, his hands firm on the wheel. I positioned the spotlight, scanning the area ahead as we approached the address. Mark had taken the wheel this time, as usual, letting me handle the comms and spotlight. It wasn't much of a conversation in the car, just the occasional comment about how strange the night was shaping up to be, but nothing that hinted at what we were about to face. 16 Adam 59, show us code 6 at 129 Street. Can you call the homeowner and tell her we're outside? I radioed in, feeling a shift in the air as we parked near the address. 16 Adam 59, Roger code 6. Do you need an airship at this time? Dispatch responded, sounding casual enough, but I could hear a slight tension in their voice. 16 Adam 59, keep the airship on standby, I responded, not wanting to overreact, but instinctively knowing we might need backup, or at least the option to call it in quickly. We cleared the immediate area, staying vigilant, and then knocked on the front door, announcing ourselves as the police. The door opened, revealing a young woman who couldn't have been older than 21. She looked disheveled, scared, and on the verge of breaking down, her eyes wide with terror. I spoke first, keeping my tone calm but firm. You called us, ma'am? There's someone here, she replied, her voice trembling. They keep banging on the walls and making noises, like a hurt animal. I'm so scared. Are the doors locked? Any windows that may be open? I asked, trying to assess the situation quickly. No, I've locked everything. I've been hiding in my kitchen, she said, almost whispering the last part as if the walls might be listening. Okay, come to the car with us. We're going to keep you safe. I motioned for her to follow us, my voice steady despite the rising unease in my chest. She didn't hesitate, but her fear was palpable. She wasn't crying, but she was close to it. The fear was evident in the way she clutched her arms around her body. We led her to our unit, making sure she was locked securely in the back seat. Normally, this act would reassure someone in her situation, giving them a sense of protection. But even with her safe in the car, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. We called in for backup. There was a chance we were dealing with someone mentally unstable, possibly a 5150 case. We didn't want to risk an attack, especially with the strange noises she had described. Once backup arrived, we began our search of the house. The front door was locked, and after knocking, no one answered. That meant the house was empty, at least on the inside. We checked everything, all the rooms, the closets, under the beds, but there was no sign of an intruder. With that ruled out, we moved on to search the outside. We split up. Mark and I took the left side of the house while the backup unit took the right. We agreed to meet up behind the house to compare notes. But when we did, what we saw made my heart stop. There, painted on the side of the house, was a massive drawing. It was about 5 feet wide and 4 feet tall, painted in red ink that had already begun to fade into a brownish hue. The details were horrifying. An image of the devil torturing 2 women. The crude artwork was done in a mixture of what appeared to be blood and fecal matter. I had seen plenty of things in my time as an officer. Battered women, children in distress, the occasional junkie on the fringes of society, and even some wannabe Satanists who thought blood and strange symbols were cool. But nothing had shaken me like this. It wasn't the grotesque drawing itself that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, though. It was the sensation that accompanied it. In my career, I'd gotten a few calls about monsters or supernatural occurrences, usually from people who were in distress or maybe dealing with some mental health issues. It's easy to dismiss those kinds of calls, just another case of a troubled person with a wild imagination. But there was something different this time. The woman's fear had been genuine, and the drawing, it wasn't just art. It felt like a message, or worse, a warning. We had learned to keep a level head when it came to these kinds of reports. More often than not, they turned out to be nothing more than someone acting out. But this time was different. There was an unshakable feeling that we weren't dealing with a typical trespasser, or even a mentally unstable person. This felt something darker, something more dangerous. We weren't just looking for a suspect anymore. We were looking for something that might not even be human. 16am59. Go ahead and send me 2 additional units, a supervisor and an airship. KMA. Mark radioed in, his voice tight with tension. He was usually unshaken by the darker sides of the job, but even he had his limits. And whatever we were dealing with now had crossed a line. What the fuck is this? Officer Roshanda, a seasoned veteran who was quick with a joke and usually teasing Mark and me about being the textbook stereotypical cops, muttered under her breath. Roshanda had been in the field long enough to know when something didn't sit right. And this was definitely one of those times. This is some spooky shit, I replied, trying to keep my voice steady, but the truth was, my insides felt like they were crawling. I was scared, and there was no denying it. It wasn't the kind of fear you can hide behind badges or weapons. It was a primal kind of fear, the kind that gnaws at your gut and doesn't let go. We shouldn't have called in the airship. We're gonna scare this creep off. Roshanda's partner chimed in, sounding eager to just find the suspect, but his words were laced with the frustration of wanting to get his hands on whoever was behind this. We continued our search, methodical and quiet, but after hours of combing the area, we had nothing to show for it. No leads, no signs of the suspect, just empty streets and the growing sense that we were chasing ghosts. Around midnight, we had the helicopter announce a warning, telling people to lock their doors and stay inside. The quiet, unhelpful silence that followed was unsettling. Hours passed, and still, there was no sign of the mysterious person behind it all. Even a few detectives from the homicide division, the same ones who dealt with the worst cases in the city, showed up to take a look. But they found nothing either. It was 1:30 a.m. when we finally gave up, but we couldn't shake the feeling that we had missed something. We had the young woman call her brother, who came to pick her up, taking her to his house for the rest of the night. And with that, we cleared the scene. Our supervisor gave us the order to stop by a few more times during the remainder of our shift, but the atmosphere felt like we were just marking time. At 2:15 a.m., we finally called it a night, or at least that's what I thought. It was now 5:40 a.m., and we were on our way back to the station, exhausted and ready to call it a day. But then, I felt a gnawing in my gut, a sense of unease that wouldn't go away. Something wasn't right, and I couldn't let it go. "I think we need to swing by there one more time," I said to Mark, my voice more serious than I'd intended. Mark just nodded, his own instincts kicking in. We didn't speak as we drove past, but something in the pit of my stomach told me to stop. The door was open. We called in and requested backup, but this time we didn't wait. We ran inside, guns drawn, calling out our presence as the police. The air was thick with tension as we moved through the house, searching room by room. We eventually found ourselves in what we assumed was the young woman's bedroom, and then I saw it. A massive portrait hung above her bed. It was disturbingly detailed, painted in what looked like a mix of animal blood, feces, and something else I couldn't identify. The devil's image loomed large, twisted in agony, with grotesque details that made my stomach turn. The worst part, though, wasn't the painting itself. It was the words scrawled beside it in thick marker. "I found her once. I can find her again." The chill that ran down my spine was like nothing I had ever felt in my career. I could feel the dread settle in the pit of my stomach as I processed the implication of those words. This wasn't just some random sick act. This was personal. Whoever had done this wasn't just playing games. They were hunting someone. We cleared the scene again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were only scratching the surface of something far darker. I made my way back to the station, hoping that whatever it was we had encountered would just disappear, but deep down, I knew better. The next morning, after a quick breakfast at the local diner, Mark and I came back to the station to start our shift. We had a long day ahead, but something in the back of my mind kept nagging me about what we'd found. We pulled up the records, searched through our database, and eventually expanded our search into federal systems. After hours of combing through case files, we found 3 similar incidents across the country. Cases that had eerie similarities to what we had just encountered. One of those cases was in central Kansas, so we made the call. When we spoke with the detective, he didn't even let us finish before slamming the phone down. The conversation was over before it had even started. Confused, we moved on to another case in Oregon, but this time the reaction was different. The detective there had been cheerful, upbeat even, but when we brought up the case, his tone changed immediately. It was like someone flipped a switch. I missed it. I fucked up. The detective's voice was shaky now, and I could hear the panic in his words. Whatever was going on took its course, almost like there was never any police interference. I tried relocating her. I swear, I had the DA act quickly, but even after, it was no use. And the smell, oh God, those poor animals. What kind of person does this? The line went quiet for a moment before I heard the detective start crying. It wasn't the kind of breakdown you expect from a hardened officer. It was the kind of crying that comes from someone who's seen something so terrible that it completely breaks them. That was 2 weeks ago. Since then, I haven't driven past that house. I haven't even wanted to think about it. Mark, my partner, requested a transfer to a different division, and I followed suit. Whatever we had stumbled into, it wasn't something we were going to solve, and it sure wasn't something we wanted to deal with again. And just as an extra precaution, I bought a new uniform. The old one? I couldn't get the smell of blood and shit out of it. It lingered for days. She was drenched from the rain, cold and shivering, as she edged toward my counter. Her small body trembled violently, her clothes soaked through and clinging to her fragile frame. She appeared to be about 10 or 12, though it was hard to tell, her face pale and streaked with dirt and tears. Her dark hair hung limply around her face, heavy with the weight of the rain, and her eyes, wide and glassy, looked empty, as though her mind had wandered far away from where we were. In her right hand, she clutched a crumpled slip of paper, but it slipped from her fingers as she collapsed onto the floor, her body giving way to exhaustion and fear. My coworker Johnny and I rushed to her aid, our hearts pounding. We quickly wrapped her in our jackets, trying to shield her from the biting cold. I gently scooped her up in my arms, and we hurried her over to the small heating system in the corner of our office. Johnny and I were the only ones on shift, and we weren't equipped for this kind of emergency, but we did our best. We found spare clothes and blankets, quickly bandaging the bruises on her arms and legs with the first aid kit under the desk. I called in for backup, but it would take time for other officers to arrive. In the meantime, we focused on trying to comfort the girl and make her feel safe. A few minutes later, we managed to get her settled in front of the heater. Her shivering had slowed down, but her eyes remained vacant, as though the weight of her thoughts was too heavy for her to carry. I handed her a warm cup of tea, the steam rising from it like a delicate mist, and waited for her to speak. "Are you all right, kid?" I asked gently, trying to keep my voice steady despite the overwhelming worry that clouded my mind. "What happened?" She remained silent, her gaze unfocused, staring at the steam swirling from the cup in her hands. Her eyes looked like she had been crying the entire way here, her cheeks streaked with dried tear marks, but the fresh tears had stopped flowing. She simply stared at the warmth in her hands. "You're safe now, okay?" Jana said softly, her voice reassuring as she placed a hand on the girl's trembling shoulder. "Everything's going to be fine. What's your name?" I wasn't the best with kids, to be honest. I always felt like I was on the outside looking in when it came to them, but I was glad Johnny was here. She was a natural with people, especially kids. I could only hope she would get through to her. "Kay," the girl finally whispered, her voice faint like it had been caught somewhere deep in her chest. "Thank you, Kay," Jana replied warmly, her eyes kind but with a trace of concern. "Now, we need you to tell us how you got hurt and what exactly happened."
The girl's eyes flickered up to Johnny for a moment, and then, without saying a word, she handed her the piece of paper. Kay's shoulders heaved with soft sobs, her fragile body shaking once more. Johnny passed the folded paper to me with a sympathetic glance and continued to gently console the girl, her voice a soft murmur. As I unfolded the paper, I noticed the stains, dried blood smeared across the edges. The sight of it made my stomach turn. It was unsettling, but I pressed forward, hoping to understand what this girl had been through. I began to read, and immediately the words hit me in a way I couldn't explain. "Dear Kay, I'm sorry for misspelling your name. I can only hear your voice from the basement, and the dim light down here does not help. I managed to pick up your name from the conversations I have overheard. You don't know me, but I know you. Ever since you met him. Ever since he started teaching you those piano lessons. You play beautifully, and you're a fast learner. It was nice to hear your music, a ray of light in my hopeless predicament. I soon found myself eagerly waiting for those Wednesdays to come around, just to hear your voice during the lessons." The words were chilling. It was clear this was no ordinary letter. It was something far darker. Whoever had written this was watching Kay, had been listening to her, and most disturbingly, had been waiting for the opportunity to make their move. I looked up at Jan, who seemed as stunned as I was, her hand still resting gently on Kay's shoulder. The girl was silent again, her sobs muffled by the warmth of the tea and the comfort we tried to provide. But the letter, it was a message that could mean nothing good. But I knew, deep down, that you weren't safe with him around. I felt it in the pit of my stomach, that gnawing dread that told me this wasn't just some strange situation. It was something far darker, something I couldn't yet fully comprehend. He had plans for you, evil plans, ones I can't even begin to describe. He acts nice, plays the part of a charming teacher, but it's all a facade. A sinister mask to hide the monster inside him. I had seen it before, glimpses of it, brief flashes that I couldn't forget. But you couldn't see it. He had you fooled. You trusted him, and that trust is what scared me the most. I'm trapped, helpless, in this filthy, darkened space. It's a cage. A literal cage. He feeds me scraps, just enough to keep me alive. He pushes the food through a broken drainage pipe that's connected to a wall, its cemented surface rough and jagged. The food is never enough, and it's always cold, often covered in something that smells rancid. But he only sends it when he feels like it, when it pleases him. I've degraded into nothing more than skin and bones, my body too weak to move more than a few inches at a time. I don't know how much longer I have left.
There's a shower head in here, hanging next to a flickering light bulb that barely illuminates the damp walls. The water only comes out at certain intervals, and when it does, it's either scorching hot, enough to blister the skin, or freezing cold, like needles stabbing through my body. But it's the only source of water, the only way I can quench my thirst. I've grown filthy in this unhygienic cage. I smell like sweat, dirt, and something else. Something I can't place, but it's suffocating. Yet somehow, through it all, my only comfort is this paper and this pencil. I've managed to hold on to my sanity by writing short stories, by drawing, creating pictures of things I've only seen through memories or the faint light of the distant past. All of my stories, my drawings, they're about you. I knew, from the bottom of my heart, that I had to save you. I couldn't let him do to you what he did to me. I couldn't let him manipulate you, break you, like he broke me. No one should have to go through this hell. So I made a plan. Each day I watched him, studying his routine, learning his patterns. I realized that if my weak body tried to shout a warning, he might attack you before you could escape. That thought made my blood run cold. So I thought of another way. There's a weak spot in the wood of the ceiling, caused by water leaking from above. I've chipped away at it bit by bit with my pencil, careful to make as little noise as possible. I've been doing it for weeks now, all while you practiced your piano. Your music, your beautiful, soft music, kept me going. Every note you played, every chord you struck, gave me a little more strength. It was the only thing that reminded me there was still beauty in the world. It was the only thing that pushed me to keep going, to keep fighting, despite the exhaustion, despite my body screaming at me to stop. But I didn't stop. I never gave up. The hole I've created leads up to the first-floor guest room, right under the bed. He'll never know about it, not until I've crawled through it, not until it's too late. I'm gonna bring this letter to you when he takes his usual break in the middle of your lesson. I know his routine by heart now. He always goes to the bathroom then. That's when I'll make my move. You might scream when you see me. I can't blame you if you do, but I'll tell you to run. Run as fast as you can. Don't look back. Don't stop. Just keep running, no matter what. It's been a long time since I've seen the sun, but I remember the woods that surround this place. There are thorns, rocks, and a sharp fence to get through. But I know you'll make it. I believe in you. Don't think about the pain, don't think about the bleeding, because after the hurt, there will be freedom. Find the police, Kay. Tell them everything. Tell them about him, about the monster who's been holding me captive. Tell them to search for this place. But don't do it until you're safe. I couldn't bear it if something happened to you. I believe in you. I have to. Anyway, tomorrow is the day. Tomorrow is when I escape, when I try to get this letter to you. I need to stop here. I don't want him to find out what I've been doing. I wish I had more time. I wish I got to know you better, Kay. I think we could have been great friends. Sincerely from my heart, thank you for being the light in my darkness. The letter was chilling, almost suffocating in its desperation. Whoever wrote this was not only trapped, but had suffered unimaginable torment. I glanced at Kay, who was still quietly sobbing, her face a mask of grief and fear, her hands trembling as she held the crumpled paper tightly against her chest. What had she been through? What kind of monster had taken hold of her life? The mystery was only beginning to unfold. I wiped a tear away from my eye before setting the letter down on the desk, trying to steady my hands. The letter felt like a heavy weight, its inked words seared into my mind. I could barely process it all. The torment, the desperation, the plea for help. But there was one thing I knew for sure. Whatever was happening, we had to stop it. I slowly looked up at Kay, her small frame huddled on the chair, trembling beneath the blankets we'd wrapped around her. Her eyes were red, her face pale and drawn, but there was a fire in her gaze, a glimmer of something fierce and determined, despite all she had endured. She hadn't spoken much since I read the letter, but I needed more answers. "Can you describe the place?" I asked gently, my voice barely above a whisper. Kay stared at the floor for a moment, her mind clearly piecing together the fragments of her memory. Her fingers twisted nervously in the folds of the blanket. Then, as if the words were too heavy to bear, she finally spoke. It's old. Dark. There's a basement. The windows are boarded up. It smells strange, like mold and decay. She paused, her voice quivering. It's not far from here, just past the woods. Her words hung in the air, and I could feel the gravity of her statement. There was something deeply unsettling in the way she spoke, as though she was still trapped in that place, her mind unable to fully escape the horror. Minutes later, Johnny and I were speeding through the streets, the sound of our sirens cutting through the night air, followed by a convoy of officers. We had left Kay in good hands, safe with the other officers at the station while her family was notified. But my mind was elsewhere. The words in the letter kept repeating in my head, and the thought of what we might find at the house gnawed at me. When we arrived at the location, the first thing I noticed was the coldness. The house stood silent and abandoned, its windows dark and lifeless. The only signs of life were the deep tire tracks that marked the dirt road leading away from the building. They dug into the earth, fresh enough to suggest someone had just left. We ascended the porch steps, the old wood creaking underfoot. I motioned for Johnny to stay close as we approached the door. Without hesitation, we kicked it down, the sound of splintering wood echoing through the empty house. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the unmistakable smell of mildew. It was everything Kay had described: dark, decayed, forgotten. Our flashlights flickered as we made our way through the house. The hallway stretched ahead, narrow and claustrophobic, with doors that stood ajar, their interiors hidden in the shadows. We proceeded cautiously, checking each room as we passed. The house felt suffocating, the silence almost oppressive, broken only by the sound of our boots shuffling against the worn floorboards. When we reached the living room, I immediately shone my light onto the piano. It was a beautiful old instrument, but something about it felt off. The keys, once white, were now stained with dark red blotches, the unmistakable color of blood. My heart skipped a beat. The letter had warned me, but seeing it in person, the reality of it all, made my stomach churn. I moved closer, my light trembling as it scanned the room. My eyes widened as they landed on something else, something that froze me in place. There, lying motionless on the floor, were two bare feet, pale, lifeless, and stained with blood. I stopped dead in my tracks, the blood draining from my face. My body locked up, a cold shiver running down my spine. It took me a moment to gather my bearings, and when I finally kneeled down, I could feel the bile rise in my throat. There, lying before me, was a frail young boy, his body limp, his chest barely rising with the faintest breaths. His face was pale, too pale, his features gaunt and sunken. But what struck me the most was the expression, a peacefulness that felt so out of place in such a horror. His face held no fear, only an eerie calm, as if he had already accepted what was happening. I clenched my fists, the rage bubbling up from deep inside me. I couldn't understand it. How could someone do this to a child? How could someone so twisted hurt an innocent soul like this? My chest tightened, my mind racing with questions, with fury. The boy's hand twitched, and I exhaled a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. He was alive. Barely, but alive. That was all that mattered. "Janny!" I called, my voice shaky with the weight of what we'd found. Janny was by my side instantly, her face paling as she saw the boy. She crouched beside him, checking for signs of life. "He's alive," she said, her voice quiet but steady, a spark of hope in the midst of this nightmare. "We need to get him to the hospital. Now." I nodded, already dialing for backup, my mind spinning. Whoever had done this was still out there, and we were going to find them. We had to. But as we moved the boy carefully, I couldn't shake the feeling that something darker was lurking, waiting for us to make the next move. My name is Andrew Small, and I work as a police officer in a place that could easily be called the most bizarre, otherworldly town on Earth. Junction Falls. It's a small town, tucked away in the middle of nowhere, and it has its share of strange occurrences. Here's one of the oddest cases we've encountered: the annual mystery screenings at the Westbrook Drive-In. It was a quiet evening on July 15, 2006, until about 9:30 p.m., when chaos broke out. We received complaints from over 24 irate homeowners, who all claimed they couldn't sleep due to a film playing at the old Westbrook Drive-In. This immediately raised alarms because the Westbrook had been closed down since 1979, after the multiplex had put it out of business. Any movie playing there would clearly be unauthorized. When we arrived, a 1956 B-movie sci-fi horror flick called It Came From Mars was playing at full volume and brightness. However, we found no one around who could have been responsible. The only thing present was a single red 1950 Crossley station wagon, parked in Space 21B, but no one was inside. We assumed we would track down the culprit and figure out how the movie had started, but our immediate priority was to stop the film before the angry locals decided to riot in their bathrobes. Here's where things got strange. We searched everywhere: the operations booth, the dilapidated concession stands, the Crossley station wagon, and even tall trees nearby, but there were no signs of any projection or sound equipment. It was as if the film was playing by itself. After the movie finished, the lot plunged back into darkness, and the Crossley vanished as well. We were left frustrated and baffled. After that, things settled down, and the mystery screening case faded into the background. We moved on to more pressing matters, and over time, we all but forgot about it. That was until exactly 1 year later, on July 15, 2007. At 9:30 p.m., the screening started again. The same angry locals, the same empty lot, the same red Crossley station wagon in Space 21B, and once again, we found nothing. We searched high and low, but came up empty-handed. This repeated year after year. On every July 15th at 9:30 p.m., the same thing happens. It came from Mars, the red Crossley, and no explanation. It has continued every year since, with the exact same pattern. To this day, we still don't understand how the film plays without any visible equipment. However, we've discovered some interesting details about the film since the case began. It Came From Mars was financed by a man named Bill Booth, who also wrote, directed, and starred in it as the protagonist, Jack Burnley. He believed that this film would launch his Hollywood career, but the production was plagued with problems. Costs spiraled out of control, 2 actors and the chief editor quit midway, forcing Booth to edit the film himself, something that, given the result, was a poor decision. Booth bankrupted himself, paying for the Westbrook Drive-In Theater to host the film's premiere on July 15, 1956. Unfortunately, It Came From Mars was a critical disaster. The few critics who saw it gave overwhelmingly negative reviews. Booth attended the premiere alone, as the cast and crew were too ashamed to be seen with him. To make matters worse, Booth's wife left him a month later, frustrated by their dire financial situation. Humiliated and penniless, Booth drove his red 1950 Crossley station wagon to the Westbrook, parked in Space 21B again, and tragically ended his life with a gunshot. This tragic off-Hollywood story doesn't explain, however, the strange phenomenon of the film playing on its own, or how the Crossley appears and disappears every year on July 15th. The case remains officially unsolved. But when the Junction Falls Dispatch reported these details in April, many began to speculate that the ghost of the old filmmaker Bill Booth was behind the annual screenings. And on July 15th, 349 people showed up, joining the Red Crossley to watch that same low-budget, tacky, but somehow endearing film. Status: Unsolved. The Screaming House. Before I joined the Junction Falls Police Department in 2005, there was already a chilling legend surrounding an abandoned 2-story house in the Shelby neighborhood. At random hours during the night, desperate, blood-curdling screams echoed from inside, seemingly coming from a woman trapped within. Naturally, the department dispatched a unit to investigate. What they encountered, however, defied logic. The officers could never find the source of the screams. No matter where they searched, the sounds seemed to move, always coming from a part of the house where no one was. When the screams came from the master bedroom upstairs, the officers rushed to the second floor, only to find the room empty and the cries now coming from the kitchen. They ran to the kitchen, only to hear the sounds emanating from the cellar. After checking the cellar, they realized the screams had returned to the master bedroom. It was as if the sound was playing some cruel game, shifting its location each time they got close. Eventually, they called for backup, but even with officers stationed in every room, they could never isolate the source of the screams. After hours of this frustrating, maddening experience, None of the officers, 6 men and 3 women, were able to find the woman nor explain the phenomenon. All of them suffered varying degrees of psychological trauma, shaken by the unsettling sounds. The leading official theory behind the strange acoustics is that there's a subtle quirk in the house's architecture, causing the sounds to bounce unpredictably, though not everyone is convinced. No one can explain the source of the screams themselves. No woman has ever been found inside, and given how long the sounds have persisted, she couldn't have survived that long. Priests have given the house a clean bill of health, ruling out demonic activity. The man who built and later sold the house also claims he is as horrified as anyone and insists there were no architectural abnormalities or hidden compartments that could have held a captive woman. As far as the JFPD is concerned, the official advice is simple: stay away from that house. It still makes those screams, and we're no closer to figuring it out than we were years ago. Status: unsolved. Mr. Mystery's traveling circus and extravaganza. At times, seemingly unrelated cases turn out to be connected, bound together by a single cause or solution. This was the case with 2 particular incidents we were investigating: a series of disappearances among the local homeless population and reports of a clown luring people into the woods. Naturally, we focused more on the disappearances at first. However, a few weeks into the investigation, a local business owner came to the precinct with a startling piece of evidence: security camera footage from the previous night. The footage showed a drugged homeless man being led off towards the woods by none other than a clown, a post-vaudeville jester, complete with a ruffled collar and an unsettling skip in his step. The discovery of the shack and the clown. Our investigation eventually led us to a small shack on the outskirts of town, hidden in the woods. When we kicked open the door, the scene inside was nothing short of horrific. The 6 homeless men who had been reported missing, including the one seen in the footage, were dead, but not just dead. They had been subjected to unspeakable brutality. Their bodies were mutilated, burned, twisted, disfigured, hairless, and diseased. Each had been experimented on in the most grotesque manner. One man's limbs had been severed, and the limbs of others were sewn onto the backs and sides of 4 other victims, all of whom had perished from infections. The final victim, however, was unrecognizable. His body had been injected with various substances, from silicone to cement, creating grotesque lumps, warts, and other hideous growths. In the midst of this madness, we found the clown, Terry Bird, a deranged lunatic. He claimed to be working for a mysterious figure known as the Ringmaster. When pressed for details, Terry couldn't identify the Ringmaster but knew his plans. Surprisingly, the Ringmaster's only desire was to create and host a traveling carnival called Mr. Mystery's Traveling Circus and Extravaganza. Naturally, no carnival would be complete without a freak show. Terry said the Ringmaster had enlisted him to find willing or unwilling volunteers, as he put it. Terry was sentenced to life without parole, and we continued our search for this elusive Ringmaster. A year later, similar abductions began to surface in the nearby towns of Doolittle and Crosby Springs. We did our best to help, even offering Terry a deal for any information on the Ringmaster, but he simply laughed and said he liked to sell. It's cozy. As of now, any information leading to the capture of the Ringmaster comes with a $10,000 reward. Status: partially solved. Perpetrator at large. Abigail Jones, from Stamford Springs, about 10 or 12 miles southeast of Junction Falls, near the hiking trails, lies an abandoned ghost town called Stamford Springs. I'm no expert on the place, but I can tell you that it was once a small 19th century community with a general store, a clinic, a church, and a handful of houses. Inside the homes, you'll still find original furniture, clothes in closets, toys in children's rooms, animal bones in barns, and various other items that suggest the town was once lived in, but abandoned in a hurry.
What caused its abrupt end remains a mystery. It's eerie, creepy, and a popular spot for Halloween hikes and I dare you type excursions. However, that's not why I'm writing. In 2009, a hiker reported hearing strange cries coming from the backyard of one of the houses. Rangers were called, and they discovered a previously hidden cellar behind the house. Inside, they found a little girl, terrified and wearing an old-fashioned gown. She had clearly been there for an unknown amount of time. After ensuring she was safe, The rangers asked the girl her name and how she had gotten there. She introduced herself as Abigail and claimed her parents owned the house above. According to her, her parents had placed her in the cellar to fetch the other children, but they never returned. When asked about the year, Abigail insisted it was 1884 and that her parents had only been gone for a few minutes, not decades. The girl, no older than 10, was hysterical, trembling with fear and confused. Was this an incredibly convincing performance, or was she truly living in a time long gone?
Was she really a resident of 19th century Stamford Springs? The Rangers could not explain it, and the mystery of Abigail Jones remains unsolved. They took Abigail to the Junction Falls Medical Center, where she continued to play the part, wide-eyed and in awe of the modern world, her mouth hanging open in amazement. Tests were run, but there was no sign of brain damage, malnutrition, or any other medical condition. She was a perfectly healthy 9-year-old girl, yet she insisted her parents were Thomas and Elizabeth Jones, 19th century shopkeepers from Stamford Springs. It didn't take long for the authorities to dig deeper into her story. They scoured records for any trace of a missing girl matching Abigail's description, but found nothing. No birth certificate, no medical records, no social security number, and no relatives. As the case made headlines, some curious individuals did their own research, and unsurprisingly, they uncovered that a Thomas and Elizabeth Jones had indeed lived in Stamford Springs in 1884. They were shopkeepers and had 3 children, including a daughter named Abigail. Still, there was no further information about the fate of the town. Eventually, Abigail was placed with a child placement agency, and after that, no one really knew what happened to her. It remains one of the strangest stories ever to come out of Junction Falls. Status: unsolved. Ranjit Singh, explorer of the sewers. Beneath the ordinary level of the Junction Falls sewers, the area regularly accessed by maintenance crews, lies a labyrinth of tunnels that's more reminiscent of the catacombs of Paris or Odessa than a typical sewer system. It stretches deep into the earth, winding and twisting endlessly in every direction. The system is far larger than any sewer network should be for a town of this size, and it defies all logical explanations. No one knows how vast it is, how old it is, likely ancient at its deepest levels, or who built it and why. The sewer's layout is a mystery, and the department has been working slowly to map it out. Unfortunately, progress is painfully slow. Our estimates put us at about 25% mapped, though in reality, it's likely closer to 12 or 15%. For these reasons, we dread when missing person cases lead us to the sewers. But between 2006 and 2014, we had Ranjit Singh. Ranjit was a legend in Junction Falls, an experienced spelunker and outdoorsman who decided to explore the deep sewers and uncover their secrets. Not only did he offer his knowledge and assistance to the force whenever needed, but he also documented his findings on his now-defunct blog and for the Dispatch. Some of the things he encountered and recorded were truly unbelievable, including Pipetown. I've been to Pipetown myself, but it's one of Ranjit's more famous discoveries, so I'll include it anyway. Pipetown is a makeshift tent city, nestled in a cavernous sewer chamber beneath the North Side projects. It was built by and for the city's large population of addicts, vagabonds, and criminals. It's a place that feels like a third-world slum, a wasteland of tents, shacks, cardboard, aluminum sheets, and drum barrel fires. The air reeks of human waste, and illegal activities run rampant: gambling, prostitution, arms trafficking, and of course, drugs in every form imaginable. It's a lawless, filthy, dystopian swamp, one of the most heartbreaking things I've ever seen. A large number of disappearances related to the sewers seem to either end up in or involve Pipetown or its residents in some way. The Dogman, deep in a secluded corner of the tunnels, only accessible to Ranjit and his camera, he encountered something strange: a naked man with the head of a pointer dog. Fortunately, the Dogman seems harmless. From what Singh recorded, the creature was aware of his presence but showed no signs of alarm or aggression. It simply sat, stared, or pranced around on all fours like a dog. Singh claimed he saw it frequently in the sewers, always behaving in the same nonchalant manner. The official advice from the JFPD is simple: don't feed or interact with the Dogman. It's clearly managing just fine on its own, and there's no need to disrupt the balance. This one is strange. An old wooden door built into the side of one of the sewer tunnels. What's bizarre is that the door doesn't stay in one place. Ranjit isn't the only one who's encountered it, but he's the only one to have recorded it on video. The door can appear just as easily in the shallow, near-surface tunnels as it can in the deepest parts of the sewers. Nobody knows who built it, what it's for, or how it vanishes and reappears. We do know one thing though. People who enter the door often vanish without a trace. In 2013, Ranjit became the first to find someone who had disappeared through it. Tragically, the girl was dead by the time he found her, her body months old. She had walked through the door and somehow ended up in a forgotten section of the sewers where she eventually starved to death, lost and alone. It's a horrifically lonely way to perish. The clock room. This one is even stranger. A room full of clocks. There are cuckoo clocks, standard wall clocks, wristwatches, egg timers, hourglasses, and even a beautiful grandfather clock in the back corner. Singh recorded it all, but it's too far from the nearest sewer access point to be explained by someone stashing their collection there. We still have no idea what to make of this room. It's one of those mysteries that lingers, unanswered. The stalker's stash. This is one of the cases where we actually had to get involved. It wasn't paranormal, just disturbing. We found a small closet-like room near Pipetown, filled with disturbing photos of an underage local girl named Emily Fisher. The photos, taken without her knowledge or consent, were of her at school, on the bus, in her bedroom, at the pool, at family gatherings, even at a party with friends and family. Some photos showed her in compromising situations, others in happy, everyday moments. The most disturbing thing was that the photographer seemed to have no qualms about getting closer, even snapping photos of Emily while she was surrounded by loved ones. If he'd grown bold enough to take pictures in such close proximity, it was clear he might soon act on his sickening obsession. We immediately alerted the authorities and dispatched units to protect Emily and her family. Meanwhile, my partner and I hid nearby, waiting for the photographer to show up. When he did, it turned out to be a man named Davis T.S. James, a serial sex offender who had been out on bail while awaiting trial on another charge. He'd come to Junction Falls to continue his predatory behavior. We arrested him on the spot. It was one of the most revolting things I've ever witnessed. Thanks to Ranjit's discovery, we were able to stop him before it was too late. Without his sharp eye and dedication, who knows what might have happened to Emily? The story takes a haunting turn as the protagonist, part of a team sent to search for Ranjit Singh, reflects on a terrifying experience deep in the sewers. Ranjit, once their trusted guide for dealing with bizarre and paranormal occurrences, had vanished while investigating an entity known only as the Presence. His disappearance occurred after he ventured into a particularly sinister part of the tunnels in search of this ominous force, which he described as an ancient, malevolent being that seemed to exist outside of time. The Presence is an unfathomable, oppressive force that affects the physical and psychological state of anyone who enters its domain. The darkness in this room was so dense that light itself seemed helpless, and the isolation was suffocating. The protagonist and their team experienced a terrifying feeling of being watched, and their senses were distorted, with sounds and light fading into nothingness. The Presence communicated without words or visuals, inducing a deep, existential terror, one that hinted at concepts far beyond human understanding, like infinity and death. The Presence seemed to warp time, leaving the team members unsure whether minutes or hours had passed. Despite tracking Ranjit's path, marked by glow sticks and flares, they were unable to find him. The official explanation for his death was that he died in a particularly treacherous part of the sewers. However, the uncertainty lingers in the protagonist's mind, suggesting that Ranjit may still be alive, trapped in a timeless state, lost to the grasp of the Presence. His story remains unresolved, with the team left haunted by the presence of an entity that defies their understanding of reality. This part of the tale emphasizes the unknown and the terrifying idea that some mysteries, especially those related to time and space, are too vast for human comprehension. The unresolved nature of Ranjit's fate leaves an eerie, open-ended conclusion, provoking both existential and supernatural fears. I've been serving as a police officer in Mineral Wells, Texas, for almost 5 years now. For those unfamiliar, Mineral Wells is about 50 miles west of Fort Worth, with a population hovering around 16,000. The locals here are the kind of people you'd expect to meet in a small town, hardworking, religious, and genuinely kind. However, there's always been something a little unsettling about them, as if they're all hiding a secret that no one is supposed to know. After sunset, the town becomes almost completely deserted, no pun intended, and driving through its empty streets at night can give you a feeling of unease, even from the comfort of my patrol car. In the time I've spent here, I've witnessed things that are hard to explain, things that even I find hard to believe at times. If not for my own strange childhood experience, I might chalk it all up to a case of paranoia. But I know what I've seen, and some of these things, while impossible to explain, are very real. I want to share one of those experiences with you now. If you find it intriguing, I can share more. Believe me, I have plenty. To truly understand the oddities of Mineral Wells, you need to know a bit about its history. I came to know much of it after visiting the local historical society about 6 months into my time here. The town was founded in 1881 by a man named J.A. Lynch. It was after Lynch dug the town's first drinking water well that he claimed the strange-tasting water cured his rheumatism. His wife, Mrs. Lynch, also found relief from her arthritis after drinking it. In the 1800s, mineral-enriched water was believed to have medicinal properties, and word of the healing powers of this water spread quickly. A few years later, a second well was dug, and then a third. This third well, however, became famous for a different reason. A woman with dementia drank from it regularly, and her dementia was suddenly cured. The local children started calling it the Crazy Water Well, and the name stuck. Soon, crazy water became the term used for the miraculous water that flowed from the earth. As you can imagine, this word of mouth spread, and by the early 1900s, Mineral Wells had transformed into the South's premier health resort, with countless mineral wells, bathhouses, spas, and hotels catering to those seeking healing. Many of these visitors were elderly or in poor health, and many never left town alive. Today, Mineral Wells is a shadow of its former glory. While it still has a few industries, the town mainly operates as a tourist and retirement destination. But don't let that fool you. For those of us who call this town home, Faulkner's famous quote resonates with a deeper meaning. The past is never dead. It's not even past. My first strange encounter with the town's peculiarities came about a month after I joined the force. We received a frantic 911 call about a dead body. I still remember the address, 200 Hubbard Street, home to the Baker Hotel. I was working the night shift at the time, standard procedure for rookies, and the call came in around 12:30 a.m. My partner and I were nearby, so we arrived quickly. When we got there, the person who had called 911 was gone, but the body was still there, just as described. It was a young woman, her body sprawled on the red brick steps leading up to the hotel's entrance. Her back was obviously broken, and her head was completely crushed. To make it worse, she was completely nude. It was the first dead body I had ever seen, and it was a gruesome sight. You didn't need an expert to see that she had fallen from a significant height. I remember looking up at the building, searching for any balconies she might have fallen from. There were none, but there were plenty of open windows. Old windows, too, with none of the modern safety features you'd expect. I later learned the Baker Hotel had been shut down in the 1970s, but no one ever seemed willing to explain why. We secured the scene and called in the investigative unit. The girl turned out to be 29-year-old Pamela Allen. She had lived in Mineral Wells all her life and worked as a manager at a local cafe. On the night in question, Pamela had been out with some girlfriends at a bar near the hotel. One of the girls who had been with her told the investigators that they had all been hanging out on the 7th floor of the hotel, drinking after the bars closed when they suddenly realized Pamela was nowhere to be found. They started looking for her and found her clothes in a pile in one of the rooms next to an open window. That's when they realized she had fallen and called 911. They had 2 pieces of information to offer. First, Pamela had been overheard saying she needed to go meet Virginia, but none of them knew any friend by that name. The second was that there were rumors around town that she had been having an affair with the owner of the cafe where she worked, though none of them had ever seen her with him. Hearing all this seriously disturbed me. By all accounts, Pamela was a well-adjusted young woman with no reason to kill herself. Why did she do it? And why did she take off all her clothes before jumping? After the full investigation, I didn't hear much more about the case. The investigators thought the circumstances were odd, but strange things happened in mineral wells, and they had more pressing cases. The case was closed.
It wasn't until about 5 months later, when I was going through manuscripts at the Historical Society's archives, that I came across a passage that sent chills down my spine. Here's what it said. One story involving the Baker Hotel revolves around a woman named Virginia Brown, a resident at the hotel, who was the alleged mistress of T.B. Baker, the owner and builder of the hotel. According to legend, Virginia was upset over the affair and drunkenly plunged to her death after jumping from the 13th floor. Many visitors to the hotel before it closed in 1972 reported seeing a bloody woman, sometimes wearing a red dress and sometimes nude, roaming the halls after midnight. This freaked me out, and I was about to leave, but before I did, I noticed there was a reference to another document. It turned out to be the hotel's ledger from the mid-1900s. I searched for Virginia Brown's name and found it. She had indeed been a resident at the time, and there was a notation under the room heading, Room 714. It was then I knew something extremely strange was going on in Mineral Wells, Texas. But what exactly? Incidentally, I would later find out that the Baker Hotel is still relatively famous nationally, and I think one of those ghost story TV shows even did an episode about it. If you want to hear more about my experiences in mineral wells, check out Part 2 coming soon. God knows I need someone to hear them. I wanted to thank everyone for their interest in my experiences in Mineral Wells, Texas. I'm grateful for the opportunity to share them. Please keep in mind that although all these various experiences may not fit together logically or chronologically, I believe they are all part of a larger puzzle that I'm still putting together. One day, about 4 months after the incident at the Baker Hotel, my partner and I were called to a disturbance at the Veterans Affairs building on SE 6th Ave. Sometimes we would switch shifts with the day patrol, and this was one of those days. When we arrived, there was a crowd of people outside, most of whom looked visibly shaken. As we approached the door, I understood why. The sounds coming from inside were downright terrifying. Deep, guttural moans and screams emanated through the air. The sounds were so unnatural that we could not initially determine whether the person making them was male or female. If I'm being honest, at the time I wasn't even sure if they were human. We entered the foyer with our pistols drawn, swiftly clearing it and the adjacent rooms. All the employees had already evacuated, which was a relief. The air inside felt unnaturally cold and damp, a stark contrast to the usual summer heat of Texas, even with the air conditioning running. Maybe it was just my imagination, but the eerie sounds seemed to be coming from not only the office at the back but also from the walls around us. And what was that faint noise? Whispers.
I glanced at my partner, but he seemed fully focused on the door in front of us. We approached and tried the handle, but it was locked. We called out, but it quickly became clear that the person inside had no intention of opening the door. My partner, being the bigger guy, stepped back and delivered a powerful kick to the door handle, shattering the frame and sending the cheap door flying inward. For a brief second, and I know this sounds insane, I could have sworn the person inside was wearing a long white doctor's coat and a white mask over his mouth. But, in the blink of an eye, that image disappeared, and instead we were faced with an older man wearing green fatigues, holding a letter opener. It was one of those large, dull ones you often get from the Rotary Club. His remaining hair stood on end, as if he'd rubbed it against a balloon. He was babbling, much of it unintelligible, but I managed to catch a few fragments between the incoherent moans. "Not the water again, not the water, it's cold, so cold, it's time for your treatment, I'm a better boy, so much better, I won't run, I won't." Suddenly he lunged at us, raising the letter opener. My partner yelled, "Drop it, as we aimed our guns. But before we could react, the man slammed his palm down on the desk beside him and drove the letter opener straight into the back of his hand, forcing it through the wood of the desk. He stared at us with wide, terrified eyes and gasped, "He's coming," before collapsing to the floor. I stayed with him while my partner rushed outside to get paramedics. During my final sweep of the office, I noticed a large, half-empty box of mineral water, collected and bottled locally by the Crazy Minerals Company. I grabbed a bottle and slipped it into my pocket. As the paramedics wheeled him out, they initially attributed his actions to possible early-stage dementia. My partner pointed out a small brass plaque mounted outside the building. It read, "Millings Sanitarium, National Register of Historic Places, Mineral Wells, Texas, 1929. After the incident at the VA, I was determined to learn more about mineral wells, so I went to the Historical Society during my day off, as I mentioned in Part 1, to dig into the town's strange past. Later that night, I found myself alone in my apartment, deep in thought. I tried to push the memory of the old man from my mind, but I couldn't shake it. What had happened was too odd, and the fact that the building had once been a sanitarium only added to the mystery. At this point, I wasn't even sure I believed in ghosts or the supernatural, but what had occurred seemed to point to something unnatural. All I knew for sure was that I had experienced two otherworldly events in mineral wells. They didn't seem connected, yet together they suggested something sinister was at play in the town. What was causing these strange occurrences, and what did the crazy water have to do with it? For a moment, I considered leaving mineral wells, but I quickly discarded the idea. I was here to do my job, to protect and serve, and maybe, just maybe, figure out the town's dark secret. The next night, while on patrol, I brought up the old man from the VA to my partner, Officer James Orr, a 15-year veteran of the Mineral Wells Police Department and lifelong resident of the town. "Crazy old man, huh?" James said. He almost got himself shot. "Did you notice anything strange about him?" I asked, trying to keep my voice neutral. I wasn't ready to tell him what I thought I'd seen or heard, fearing he'd think I was losing my mind. As I moved up to the second floor, the air grew colder, and the smell worsened. It was a thick, musty odor that made my stomach turn. I pulled my collar up and took a deep breath before continuing my search. The flickering light from the third-floor window caught my attention again. Whoever was up there wasn't trying to hide their presence. I made my way up the stairs to the third floor. The building creaked and groaned under my weight, as though it was reluctant to support me. When I reached the top, the light was brighter now, and I could hear faint sounds coming from behind one of the rooms, a soft, rhythmic tapping. I approached the door cautiously, my flashlight cutting through the gloom. As I got closer, the tapping sound became clearer, almost like someone was drumming their fingers on something hard. My hand hovered over the door handle. I hesitated. My instincts told me something wasn't right, but I couldn't back out now. I turned the handle and pushed the door open. The room was dim, but I could see the silhouette of a man sitting in the middle, facing away from me. The candlelight cast an eerie glow, and I could just make out the shape of something heavy resting in front of him. He didn't turn around, and the tapping had stopped the moment I entered. "Hey man, you're not supposed to be here," I called out, trying to sound authoritative but feeling unsettled. No response. I stepped further into the room. The man was still, his hands resting on his knees. There was something off about him. He looked too still. I took a few more steps, and that's when I saw it. There, in front of him, was a small metal bucket filled with water. I couldn't see much else at first, but as I moved closer, the candlelight flickered just enough to reveal something that made my blood run cold. The man's face was pale, his eyes wide open and staring. He wasn't alive. His body was unnaturally stiff, like he had been sitting there for days or longer. I recoiled, almost stumbling backward, but I caught myself before making a sound. The worst part wasn't that he was dead, it was the look on his face. The terror was frozen there, like he had seen something that had driven him to this state before his death. And then it hit me, the water in the bucket. The same mineral water I had seen before, the same brand from the Crazy Water Company. Something was wrong with this town, and the more I uncovered, the darker the truth seemed to become. I immediately pulled out my radio to call for backup, but before I could speak, the light flickered again. This time, it went out completely. The room plunged into darkness. I immediately turned my head and looked at the building through the rearview mirror again, my heart racing. The flame flickered for a brief moment, but it was unmistakable. It was a candle, just like before. But there was no one there. No one who could have lit it. Not anymore. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, my palms sweating. I tried to convince myself it was just a trick of the light, a reflection or something. But the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I couldn't shake the feeling that I hadn't left the Norwood Hospital alone. As I continued driving, I glanced at the road ahead, but every so often, I couldn't help but look back at the rearview mirror. Each time, that small flicker of light seemed to grow brighter. Then, the laughter. Soft, high-pitched, like children's voices echoing faintly on the wind. It was distant, but it felt like it was closing in, as though the sound was being carried from behind me, just out of sight. I cursed under my breath. This wasn't just some creepy old building or a drug-addled man rambling nonsense. Something was wrong, and I couldn't shake the thought that the children the man spoke of were still there, still roaming those halls. Me. The thought that I had witnessed something that I couldn't explain was unsettling. And it wasn't the first time something strange had happened in Mineral Wells. After a few more miles, I finally glanced in the rearview mirror one last time. This time, the candle was gone. But the laughter remained, and it lingered in the air as I drove, following me through the night, just like the shadows of the hospital behind me. By the time I reached the station, my nerves were on edge. I parked the squad car and sat there for a moment, letting the silence envelop me. There was something about this place, something that kept drawing people back. Something I was beginning to understand wasn't just in the buildings or the stories. It was in the very air here, something old and deeply rooted in the land itself, like the crazy water. No matter how many times you told yourself it was nothing, it always had a way of coming back. I stepped out of the car and locked it, but before I walked into the station, I looked back toward the direction of the hospital. For a brief moment, I thought I saw something move in the window on the third floor. I shook my head, refusing to believe it. But deep down, I knew I couldn't ignore it forever. Something in Mineral Wells had changed me. Something had started following me, and I wasn't sure how long I could outrun it. I leaned forward, absorbing her words. Everything she said aligned with my growing suspicions. It was hard to grasp, but the pieces were starting to fit together. The unexplained events, the strange occurrences at the Norwood Hospital, the eerie figures I had seen and heard. They all had a common thread. And now, hearing Mary Scott's explanation, I realized that Mineral Wells had become a magnet for something far darker than I had initially imagined. So, you're saying that the mineral water, it's not just a local curiosity, but something that keeps the spirits tied to this place? I asked, my voice tinged with disbelief. Exactly, she replied. You see, the mineral water isn't just any natural spring water. It's been tainted, or perhaps more accurately, it's anchored something that should have been long gone. I believe it's become a conduit, a portal, if you will, that allows the dead to stay here, lingering, restless. And for the people who drink it, well, it blinds them. It dulls their senses, making them more susceptible to whatever forces are at play here. I was silent for a moment, trying to process everything she was saying. The strange feeling that had plagued me ever since I arrived in Mineral Wells, the sense that something wasn't right, now had an explanation. And it was worse than I had imagined. But why doesn't everyone see it? I asked. Why do some of us experience these things, while others remain oblivious? That's the question, isn't it? Mary mused, her eyes distant for a moment, as though she were lost in thought. I suspect it's a combination of factors. The water does more than just dull the senses. It may even block certain people from experiencing the true nature of this place. But for those of us who haven't been numbed by it, we see what's really here. And those who are open to it, well, the spirits reach out. They want something. I shifted uncomfortably in my chair. What do they want? Her eyes darkened. They want to be remembered. They want to be heard. And some of them, they want revenge. Her words hung in the air, thick with an unsettling finality. I took a sip of my tea, trying to steady my nerves. The town had always had a strange reputation, but now it seemed that the legends were more than just stories. There was something real, something dangerous, lurking beneath the surface. Do you think it's just the water that's responsible for this supernatural influence? I asked. Mary shook her head. The water is a major factor, but it's not the only one. The land here has a history, a dark one. There's a long line of violence and tragedy, and I believe that's contributed to the energy that permeates this town. From old mining accidents to violent conflicts, the souls of those who perished here have never truly left. They're trapped, and the water just keeps them here in limbo. The weight of her words was heavy, and I found myself questioning everything I thought I knew about this place. The hospital, the people I had met, the strange occurrences, it was all connected. But how far did this go? And what was the ultimate price to pay for the knowledge I was uncovering? I cleared my throat, trying to focus. So, what do we do now? How do we stop it? Mary gave a small, knowing smile. Well, dear, that's the hardest part. You can't just stop it. You can try to help, try to put the spirits to rest, but the town's past is too ingrained. The water is just the beginning. You'll have to dig deeper if you want to uncover the whole truth. I felt a chill settle in my chest as I realized how deep this mystery went. And you think I can handle that? I think you can, she said, her eyes locked onto mine. But be careful. There are things in this town that aren't happy to be disturbed. And the more you uncover, the more you risk being pulled into their world. Her warning resonated in my mind as I left her home that afternoon. The air felt heavier, thicker, as I drove away. It wasn't just the weight of the story she had shared, it was the knowledge that I had just begun to peel back the layers of something that might never be fully understood. But one thing was clear. I wasn't alone in this, and whatever I discovered next, I couldn't stop now. The fear crept up my spine like 1,000 tiny needles. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move. The sight of these children, their faces twisted in horrific smiles, sent a chill down my entire body. Each time I blinked, their features changed again, distorted, disfigured, only to return to a normal state in the next moment, like some sickening game of stop-motion animation. I had no idea what I was dealing with. Were they ghosts? Experiments gone wrong? My mind raced through every possibility, but none made sense in that moment. One of them, the boy with the missing legs, crawled closer to me, dragging himself along the cold concrete floor, his gaze locked onto mine. The sound of his body scraping against the ground was unnervingly loud, a sound that echoed in the silence of the basement. My heartbeat thudded in my chest, louder than ever, drowning out everything else. I needed to leave. I needed to get out of there, but my legs felt as if they were cemented to the floor. It was as if the room was pushing me down, keeping me rooted in place. I fought against it, shaking my head, trying to dispel the fear that had my body locked in a vice. I finally found the strength to back away slowly, my eyes not leaving the children. Their grins never faltered, and as I moved, they followed me with their eyes. My hand grasped the door frame, and I turned toward the tunnel I had crawled through. My flashlight flickered, the beam dimming for just a moment before it returned to full strength. I scrambled through the opening, feeling the cold air rush past me. The weight of the room, of the children's gazes, was unbearable. I didn't dare look back, but as I crawled, I could hear a soft, sickening whispering, as if they were calling my name, beckoning me back into the darkness. I stumbled to my feet on the other side of the wall, breathless, my legs shaking beneath me. I didn't stop moving until I was back in the main basement room, where the light from my flashlight illuminated the familiar surroundings. I didn't stop until I was back upstairs, out of the building, and into the fresh night air. I didn't want to think about what I had just witnessed. What had been real? What had I actually seen? There was no denying that whatever I had discovered in that basement was far darker and far more dangerous than anything I had anticipated. And now, I had the files. What I was about to uncover would change everything. As I read those chilling details, the weight of what I was seeing hit me like a ton of bricks. My hands trembled, unable to steady the file. Charlie's story, his severed hand, and his mother's involvement, it was all too twisted to process. What kind of monster would put a child through something like that? A third attempt to reattach a severed limb with the help of someone named M, who I now suspected was Mariana. The note about the mother being sent to MS felt like a punch to the gut, hinting at a connection I was dreading to explore. I forced myself to keep reading, even though my mind screamed at me to stop. The next file wasn't any better. It was about a young girl named Emma, admitted for what seemed like a routine procedure, only for her case notes to slowly devolve into something horrific. The more I read, the clearer it became. This was no ordinary hospital. There were no regulations, no ethics, no compassion, only experimentation. These children were never treated. They were subjects, test subjects, in some deranged study that had gone on for years. One case stood out. A child named Daniel, described as admitted for treatment of unexplained neurological conditions, but the notes quickly veered into uncomfortable territory. There were mentions of strange chemical injections and neurological reprogramming attempts, with questionable methods. The medical jargon blurred, and I found myself wondering if this was even medical practice at all. The sense of dread that had been gnawing at me since my visit to the basement only grew stronger as I pieced together the files. The experiments, the names, the whispers about Mariana, it was all too much. I glanced at the clock. Hours had passed, and the oppressive darkness outside had deepened. My entire being felt heavy, like the weight of those files was dragging me into a void. I couldn't unsee the things I'd read, and every time I closed my eyes, I saw those children from the basement. Their hollow eyes, their broken bodies, and their twisted grins. The nursery rhyme they'd sung echoed in my mind. 1 for tongue and 2 for nose, 3 for eyes and 4 for toes. Ring the bell, the time is near, ding dong, Mariana's here. I had to know more, but every step I took toward the truth felt like I was sinking deeper into something I couldn't escape. Mariana, she wasn't just a name anymore. She was the heart of this nightmare, the key to unraveling the horrors that had been buried in the shadows of the Norwood Hospital. I sat in stunned silence, the pieces of the horrifying puzzle beginning to fall into place, though I didn't want to accept it. Desperately, I rifled through the other files, but the truth was undeniable. Mariana had been mutilating children, and Dr. Norwood was using them as practice for his sickening surgeries, trying to reassemble their broken bodies. The missing eyes, the eerie nursery rhyme, the strange room upstairs, even Victor's cryptic words, it all suddenly made sense. Dr. Norwood wasn't running a hospital. He was performing grotesque experiments on children under the guise of medical treatment. The horrifying thought gnawed at me. How had he gotten away with it for so long? Where were the outraged parents? Why hadn't anyone stopped him? But those answers weren't in the files. I slammed them shut, disgusted by what I had uncovered. The weight of it all pressed down on me like an anchor, sinking me further into despair. For days, I couldn't shake the heaviness inside me. My mind had been consumed by the horrors I'd learned. But life in Mineral Wells carried on, and I still had a job to do. Traffic accidents, minor crimes, the usual mundane duties of a small-town police officer. It was tempting to believe I could go back to being normal, to forget the monstrous things I had uncovered and bury myself in my work. But that wasn't meant to be. It wasn't long before another unsettling case came my way. A young boy from a well-known local family had suffered a terrible accident with a riding lawnmower, the blade mangling his arm so badly that doctors had no choice but to amputate. It was a heartbreaking tragedy, but something about the report caught my eye. In the photo, the newspaper ran of the mower. The boy's legs were too short to have reached the pedals. How could he have been operating it at all? Then there was the case of Brad Delaney, the city council president and devout churchgoer, who one night shot his wife in cold blood while she slept. He confessed, claiming it must have been him, but he couldn't remember doing it. They found him the next morning, still in bed beside his dead wife, the crimson stain of her blood soaking the mattress. Things in Mineral Wells had taken a darker turn than I could have ever imagined. A few days later, I responded to a report of a strange smell coming from a student's room at Weatherford College, which was built on the grounds of the former Fort Wolters. The military base had been a key training site during World War II, and I had come across stories of soldiers who had taken their own lives there, their restless spirits rumored to haunt the halls. The smell from the student's room was unmistakable: death. When I arrived, the security guard led me to the door. Inside, hanging from the ceiling fan by a bed sheet, was the student's body. His face was bruised, his eyes bulging and red, his skin grotesque. A female student had screamed upon seeing him, and the guard hurriedly ushered her away. I was left alone with the corpse. The room was eerily tidy, no signs of a struggle, just the body swaying in the dim light. My heart pounded as I called in the investigative unit. Days later, I learned of an odd discovery made by one of the officers. Everything in the room was undisturbed, except for one thing: a single folded piece of paper under the desk. The officers had expected it to be a suicide note, but when they read it, they found only a few words. "I cannot go to war. I'm sorry, Mother." The note made no sense to anyone else, but I understood it. The ghost of the soldier who had died in the barracks long ago, still pacing the halls of Fort Walters, had left a message meant for someone else, someone who had been trapped in a cycle they couldn't escape. The atmosphere of the conversation was thick with tension. Stan's words weren't just the ramblings of a paranoid man. They were grounded in something darker, something I couldn't fully grasp just yet. "Your father was an orderly at Millings," I said, considering the implications. "And you've been following me because Mary told you I knew something about mineral wells. What else do you know?" Stan shifted uncomfortably, glancing over his shoulder as if to make sure no one was listening. "Not much more, just that you've been asking the right questions. You're digging into things no one dares to, and that doesn't go unnoticed around here." I could feel my pulse quicken. This town was hiding far more than I had originally believed. The pieces were starting to fit together, but there were still too many gaps. "What exactly are you trying to tell me, Stan? What's the connection between Millings Sanitarium and the things going on now?" His face darkened. "What's been happening in this town, what you've seen and heard, it's all tied to that place. The patients, the experiments, I think they never really left. The people who came to Millings who were used as guinea pigs, they didn't just disappear. Something happened to them. Something monstrous. It's all been covered up, buried deep." I stared at him, not sure whether I was dealing with a man on the edge of sanity or someone who knew far too much. "You're talking about the kind of things you wouldn't hear about in any medical journal."
Stan nodded, his eyes wide with a strange mixture of fear and resolve. "Exactly. And I think it's still going on. Some of those patients, they never died, not in the way we think. They're still out there, watching us." The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I tried to make sense of his words. "So you're saying these experiments, these treatments, turned people into something other than human?" "I'm not sure," Stan admitted. "But if you keep digging, you might just find out. Just be careful. Some things in this town are better left buried." He turned to leave, tossing the cigarette butt to the ground before walking away, leaving me standing there, more lost and confused than ever. As I watched him disappear into the distance, the weight of his words sank in. Mary had known something, and now Stan was confirming it. The horrors of mineral wells were far more than just a collection of oddities. There was a deep, dark secret lurking beneath the surface, and I had unwittingly found myself standing right on top of it. The question was, how much deeper did I want to go before it consumed me? The weight of the discovery pressed heavily on me, suffocating the air in the room. Every detail, every file I dug into, seemed to pull me deeper into a nightmare I couldn't escape. The storm had passed, but the chill remained, creeping into my bones. The connections were becoming clearer, but they weren't comforting. I had uncovered a sinister network operating in the shadows, pulling families into its web under the guise of hope. The town of Mineral Wells had become a death trap for those who sought its healing waters. Children taken from their homes, sent for treatment, and parents who came seeking a cure only to vanish into the bowels of Millings Sanitarium. The thought of it made me feel sick, like I could taste the bitterness of it on my tongue. The more I uncovered, the more isolated I felt. I wondered how many others had come close to the truth before me, only to turn back when the full extent of what they had stumbled upon became too much to bear. Was I just another fool following breadcrumbs to my own destruction? And what did it mean that I couldn't stop myself from continuing? Stan's cryptic words kept replaying in my head. Worms in the peach tree. It was all about exploiting a situation, manipulating people to benefit from their misery. And I had just uncovered the root of it all. The town itself was the peach tree, ripe for the taking, and the people who had been pulled in were the worms, wriggling through the cracks without ever realizing they were being consumed. But now I was the one digging too deep, pulling at a thread that could unravel everything. The next day, I forced myself out of bed. The fog of exhaustion and hopelessness was starting to lift, but I could feel it lingering like a shadow. I needed to find Mary. She was the missing piece.
I didn't trust Stan, but her connection to all of this, her involvement, could explain so much more. I dressed slowly, my mind spinning with the possibilities. I didn't know what she knew or what side she was on, but I couldn't shake the feeling that she held the answers I was desperately seeking. The people behind Millings weren't just doctors. They were masterminds, weaving a web that spanned far beyond this small town. If I was going to stop them, I needed to understand their full operation. As I walked toward the door, my phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a text message from an unknown number. Meet me at the old mill. Tonight, midnight. A cold shiver ran down my spine. There was no signature, no clue as to who had sent it, but I didn't need to know. I knew the mill. I'd heard the stories, and it felt like my only option. I grabbed my jacket, my heart pounding as I stepped into the night. The clock was ticking, and I had no idea what I was walking into. But at least, for once, I was finally moving towards something. I stood there, frozen, as Mary's words crashed over me. The storm that had been brewing inside me felt insignificant compared to the one she was enduring. The truth she had just shared was enough to make everything I had learned feel even darker. This wasn't just some conspiracy about a small town's secret past. This was personal. The very woman I had been trying to piece together in my mind was now an integral part of the horror. And the scars she carried, literal and emotional, were a testament to the legacy of violence that ran deep through her family's history. Her tears fell freely now, and it seemed like she was seeing it all again, the darkness that had haunted her since childhood. The bell, the memory of her grandmother, Mariana, and the twisted inheritance of suffering that had passed down the generations. I stepped forward, instinctively reaching for her, unsure if my touch would be any comfort, but desperate to offer something. "Mary?" My voice was barely above a whisper. "I'm so sorry. I didn't know. I didn't understand." She looked up at me, eyes red from crying, but there was something almost defiant in her gaze. "That's the problem, isn't it? No one understood, but you're starting to. And that's why they're coming after you too." My stomach dropped. They? Who were they? The people who had haunted this town for so long, the ones who had silenced every whisper of truth? Or was it something more, something darker, something that had never really left? "I don't know if I can handle this, Mary. I'm already in too deep. But what can we do? What are we supposed to do now?" I felt helpless, powerless, as though every move I made was one step closer to a fate I couldn't control. She wiped her eyes, trying to steady herself, and for a moment, I saw the strength that had gotten her this far. "You've already done more than you realize. The files, what you found, they've been hidden for a reason. They can't be ignored anymore. But we need to be careful. People don't just disappear from this town. They're erased. And if you keep digging, if you keep pushing, you'll find out just how far this thing goes." I felt the weight of her words settle in my chest, cold and suffocating. She was right. I couldn't stop now. I couldn't walk away after everything I had uncovered, not with the lives of those children and their families hanging in the balance. But the danger was real, and as Mary's sobs began to quiet, I knew that my quest for answers had just taken a turn into a much darker, more treacherous path. "I'll help you, Mary," I said, my voice steadying. "I don't know how, but I'll help. We'll stop this." She nodded, her face pale but resolute. "We're already too far gone to turn back. You need to be ready. They won't stop, not until they've finished what they started." And with those words, I understood. The fight was bigger than I ever could have imagined. It wasn't just a town haunted by the past. It was a machine, one built on secrets, pain, and sacrifice, and it wasn't done yet. It had its claws in the town, and now it had them in me too. There would be no turning back, no safe place to run. I couldn't shake the image of those scars, Mary's and her mother's, etched into my mind as we walked back into the night. What I had uncovered wasn't just history. It was still happening, just under the surface, waiting to claim anyone who dared to uncover it. And now, I was part of that story too. The air in the small room seemed to thicken as Teresa's words settled in. A curse. It wasn't just the town. It wasn't just the past. It was something far more potent, something that had wrapped itself around the very fabric of this place and had begun to seep into the present, infecting everything it touched. I could feel my heart pounding as I tried to process what she was saying. Spirits can be incited to violence? I echoed, my voice shaking. The thought of the dead not only haunting the living, but being capable of causing harm was almost too much to bear. Teresa nodded slowly, the painted eyes on her mask staring at me with an intensity that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The living are never as safe as they think they are. The dead can be twisted, just as the living can. Fear, anger, grief, these emotions, they can stir them. It's not always the spirit's fault. But in mineral wells, there's something else, something darker than grief or rage. I swallowed hard, trying to suppress the rising dread in my chest. What do you mean? What's happening there? Teresa leaned in slightly, though her mask remained unnervingly still, her painted eyes never leaving me. The water that made that town famous, the one people thought would heal them, it's not a cure. It's a trap. It draws the souls of the lost to it, but instead of finding peace, they are kept there. Trapped between worlds, unable to move on. And those who drink from it, well, they are marked. The water brings the dead closer, and it keeps them tied to this world. She paused, as though weighing how much to say next. But it's more than just the spirits. Something was done to them. Something in that water. That is what made them violent. The town was built on blood, sacrifices, rituals, and deeds that should never have been done. My stomach turned. Blood? Rituals, sacrifices. This wasn't just an abandoned town with a haunted history. This was something far more sinister, a place that had been nurtured by darkness. Is that why people are still vanishing? Why the spirits are still so angry? I asked, almost afraid to hear the answer. Teresa nodded again. The spirits of the lost are restless, yes, but the ones who cause harm, they're not just angry. They're bound to the town, tied to the water, tied to the land. And those who dig too deep, those who uncover what was hidden, they become targets. The town is like a living thing, and it will defend itself. The curse cannot be broken easily. It's embedded in the land, in the water, in the air itself. My mind was reeling. Every word she spoke added another layer to the nightmare I had already uncovered. The more I learned, the worse it became. And now, with Teresa's cryptic warning, I felt like I had crossed a line I could never uncross. There was no turning back. Is there any way to stop it? I asked, the words feeling heavy in my mouth. Teresa's gaze softened, but there was no comfort in her eyes. It's not about stopping it. It's about surviving it. The dead are not the only thing you need to fear. There are others. Those who control what happens in mineral wells. The ones who keep the curse alive. She paused, the weight of her words settling around us like a storm cloud. But you've already been marked. It's too late for you to turn back. All you can do now is try to find the source, the heart of it, and face it. If you don't, the spirits will come for you, and there will be no mercy. I felt a chill spread through my chest, and I realized that my quest for the truth had just led me to the brink of something far darker than I could have ever imagined. The spirits, the curse, the water, it wasn't just a story anymore. It was real, and it was coming for me. I had no choice but to continue, to seek out the heart of the evil that had plagued mineral wells for so long. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the more I uncovered, the less chance I had of making it out alive. Teresa's voice broke through my thoughts. Be careful. There is power in the land. The spirits may not always show themselves, but they are watching. They know what you seek, and they will not let you take it from them easily. I nodded, feeling the weight of her warnings settle on me. The road ahead was darker than I had ever feared, but I had already come too far to turn back now. The past was never dead, and it was coming for me with a vengeance. I felt a cold dread tighten in my chest as I stumbled deeper into the house, my boots making sickening squelches with every step. My breath came in shallow bursts, and my mind struggled to keep up with what I was seeing. It was like a nightmare unfolding in real time, too surreal, too grotesque to fully comprehend. My eyes darted around the room, trying to focus on anything but the carnage around me. The blood seemed to be everywhere, pooling in unnatural shapes, staining the walls and the furniture. But it was the body parts that seized my attention, disjointed, scattered across the floor like a twisted jigsaw puzzle. A foot, severed and discarded in one corner. A tongue, its edges raw, oozing red. An eyeball, staring blindly from a patch of gore. The fragments of a life, discarded with horrifying indifference. I couldn't help the wave of nausea that hit me. My stomach churned violently and I fought the urge to vomit, but the stench of death was overwhelming, stinging my nostrils and making my head spin. I forced myself to move, my instincts driving me forward, even though every part of me screamed to turn back. The trail of blood led me through the living room, past the broken remnants of what had once been a cozy home. My hands shook as I gripped the edge of the doorframe leading into the kitchen. What I saw there nearly broke me. The entire floor was covered in thick pools of blood, and the body parts were even more gruesome. Disjointed limbs, shredded pieces of flesh, and bones scattered in grotesque disarray. The sight made my head swim, and I struggled to keep my composure. I could barely see through the haze of terror clouding my vision. Everything felt muffled, like I was moving through thick fog. The only thing that seemed real was the smell, the heavy, metallic scent of blood, mixed with something darker, something ancient. I took a shaky step forward, barely noticing the crunch of broken glass under my feet. There was something about the room that felt wrong, like the walls themselves were closing in, suffocating me. I heard a faint creaking sound, as if something or someone was moving in the darkness. But the room was empty. It was just me, the blood, and the remnants of whatever horror had transpired here. A voice echoed through my mind, distant but familiar. Theresa's words came back to me. You have a friend in grave danger. But I wasn't sure if it was Mary who was in danger anymore, or if it was me. Through my blurred vision, I stumbled through the kitchen, weaving around the small island at the center of the room. It was there I found Mary, or rather, what was left of her, slumped against the far cabinets. Her face, what remained of it, was unrecognizable, like a grotesque mask from a horror movie. Her nose had been cleanly removed, and two bloody cavities where her eyes should have been stared back at me. I couldn't help but wish I had Theresa's mask, to cover her eyes, maybe bring some semblance of peace, as if Theresa could somehow restore what was lost. And then it hit me, the crushing truth. This was my fault. I had brought Mary into this nightmare, and now she was dead because of me. My selfish actions, my inability to let go, she had paid the price. I had killed her. My legs gave out beneath me, and I crumpled to the floor, overwhelmed with despair. I collapsed in the mess, surrounded by the gore, my hands shaking as I tried to make sense of it all. In the midst of the blood and horror, my fingers brushed against something cold and slick. It was a large kitchen cleaver, still slick with fresh blood, lying on the floor beside Mary's body, as if it had fallen from her hand in the moments before her life was violently taken. It wasn't long before they found me, kneeling in the blood-soaked kitchen, covered in the remnants of the nightmare. The neighbors, tired of the incessant sirens, had called the police. James was among the officers who arrived, his face one of disbelief and horror as he surveyed the scene. "Jesus Christ, man, it's a bloodbath in here. What happened?" he asked, his voice thick with shock. I could barely speak, my throat tight and constricted. It was too late. I tried to stop it. The words escaped in a hoarse whisper as James helped me to my feet. "Who did this?" he pressed. I opened my mouth to answer, but the words wouldn't come. How could I explain this? How could I put into words the unfathomable horror that had just unfolded? "Is any of this your blood? Are you hurt?" James asked again. "No, I'm fine," I said, but even as I spoke, I knew the lie was hollow. I wasn't fine. Far from it. Within minutes, the rest of the team arrived, their presence a blur of activity as they set up yellow tape, photographed the scene, and gathered evidence. In a town like Mineral Wells, you didn't have the luxury of high-tech tools, fingerprint dusting, or laser mapping the scene like in big cities. The investigators did their best with what they had, and I could see the grim determination in their eyes. Still, I felt a pang of guilt for the man who'd have to gather up all those body parts. It was the kind of job you'd never wish on anyone. My clothes, shoes, and equipment were all bagged up, evidence of my involvement in the scene. They photographed me from head to toe, taking blood swabs, documenting every detail. As an officer, I was allowed to go home and shower before heading to the precinct to give my statement. Any other civilian would have been arrested on the spot, but the badge seemed to offer a degree of protection, however temporary. By the time I arrived at the precinct, clean-shaven and in fresh clothes, the reality of the situation was starting to sink in. My black satchel was slung over my shoulder, a reminder that my life, was still moving forward, despite the chaos. I was led into a small interrogation room where they set up a camcorder in the corner and offered me a cup of coffee. I politely declined. I wasn't thirsty, not for anything. The recorder flickered to life as they deleted old footage, the sound of the machine filling the quiet room. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. Shouldn't I have been meeting with a superior, simply giving my statement? Why was I being filmed? Then they read me my Miranda rights, and the weight of it all crashed down on me. I chose to waive my right to an attorney, thinking I had nothing to hide. I wasn't involved in Mary's death. I hadn't killed her. But looking back, I realized that was the first mistake. My emotions had rendered me nearly catatonic, and the instinct to fight for myself, to explain everything, had faded into nothingness. I told them everything: the possessions, the experiments, Teresa's warnings, the water, the spirits. I showed them the files, hoping someone would understand. I begged them to look into the cursed water, to stop the bottling, to investigate Mineral Well's strange happenings. But when I described Mary's self-mutilation, the way she had cut herself, the way the violence unfolded, they didn't believe me. Their faces told the story, skeptical, judgmental, dismissive. Why had I been at her house that night? A psychic told me she was in danger. I could see their eyes roll as they heard those words. They didn't believe me. And as I continued to explain the ghosts, the visions, I felt their patience thinning. By the time I finished, I had become a suspect in my own case. I was placed on temporary leave and locked in a holding cell. The following weeks blurred together in a haze of confusion. I was officially arrested, no bond granted, and no hope of freedom. The scene had been too gruesome, too damning. I was covered in blood, wielding the murder weapon. At least that's how it looked. The medical examiner confirmed what seemed impossible. Mary couldn't have done this to herself. She couldn't have survived the mutilation long enough to inflict such carnage. And even if she could have, why would she do it? Nothing about the situation made sense. This section delves deeper into the protagonist's psychological unraveling and descent into despair. He confesses his role in deceiving the readers, revealing that he is not an officer anymore and that he was deemed unfit to stand trial due to his mental state. His attorney successfully portrayed him as a stressed-out cop who snapped, which led to his commitment to a mental facility for a crime he did not commit. His reflection on the nature of justice and the hopelessness of his situation adds a somber tone to the narrative. The protagonist grapples with the idea that life is often unfair and doesn't always resolve in a way that brings justice or redemption. He acknowledges that there will be no happy ending for himself, Mary, or any of the victims in Mineral Wells. This confession contrasts the hope he once had with the harsh reality of his present life, where he faces constant numbness, fear, and regret. The final passage leaves the reader with an eerie sense of dread, as the protagonist prepares to leave for another treatment, adding to the sense that his suffering is far from over. The mention of screams in his dreams subtly ties back to the horrific events he's witnessed, reinforcing the inescapable nature of his trauma.
Stories may end, but the fear remains. Subscribe to uncover more secrets hidden in the darkness. Until we meet again in the world of nightmarish shadows.